Chapter 1960. While Hun Ku was waiting, Luo Fan was not interested in waiting any longer. With just a greeting, he used the power of this strange force to directly choose one of the countless large fragments of the world and directly entered it, beginning a new round of his journey. He had been preparing for a long time to travel between the fragments of the great worlds. It was just that there had been all sorts of problems that had disrupted his plans, forcing him to run all over the place. It was only now that he finally found an opportunity to carry out this plan. The fragments of the world were fragments of a larger world. Even though they had developed their own mysteries after such a long period of time, such as transforming into a perfect world or directly turning into a chaotic planet that revolved in a chaotic state, the essence of the larger world fragment still existed. If he carefully comprehended it, he would naturally be able to comprehend some of the mysteries of the large world, which would be extremely beneficial for him to increase his knowledge and accumulate comprehension. Just as he had expected, the time taken for the space maiden from the alternate timeline to return from her own timeline was relatively long. At least, it was so compared to Hun Ku's own perception of time. Luo Fan had traveled to more than 100 world fragments, and he had even watched a dozen of them collide with that side of the world and be completely devoured by that world. More than 3 million years had passed, but the space maiden from the alternate timeline still had not returned. Hun Ku was still anxiously waiting on the platform. To Hun Ku, this was undoubtedly a form of cruelty. However, it was also a form of tempering for him. In this almost hopeless wait, her mood initially became more and more irritated as time passed, even to the point of almost going crazy. However, as time continued to pass, this irritability and even madness gradually passed. Instead, she became calm again. This kind of change from madness to calmness was a great tempering for her temperament, causing her mind to become more and more mature. Her mind was also improved after that. After waiting for a period of time for the space maiden from the alternate timeline to return, she naturally fell into irritation and madness again, starting another cycle, and so on. Annoyance, madness, and calmness came one after another. It was like a whetstone that continuously sharpened his spirit, causing his spirit to continuously strengthen, causing his cultivation to become more and more stable. There were even faint signs of a breakthrough brewing within him. Hun Ku's emotions would only fluctuate so much if it was related to Space Maiden from a different timeline. Otherwise, no matter what, Hun Ku was a heavenly emperor, and his cultivation had even reached the level of a supreme emperor. How could he possibly be unable to hold on for a short few million years? On this day, Luo Fan, who was observing the operation of a certain chaos planet, felt his heart skip a beat. He vaguely sensed something and immediately stopped what he was doing. He activated the strange power and took a step forward, disappearing from the chaos planet in the blink of an eye. When he reappeared, he was already floating on the platform. At this moment, Hunk was sitting cross-legged in a corner of the platform, looking at the steady and calm temperament that lingered around her body. It was already much better than before. Sensing Luo Fan's arrival, Hun Ku's heart skipped a beat, and she suddenly opened her eyes. When she saw Luo Fan standing not far away from her, an inexplicable surprise suddenly appeared on her face. An indescribable look of pleasant surprise suddenly appeared on his face as he said, "Father, Daddy, is Mommy coming back?" Luo Fan smiled and said, "If my hunch is right, it should be so." Hearing this, Hun Ku jumped up. Her previous calm temperament was nowhere to be seen. Her entire expression was filled with endless excitement and anticipation. Luo Fan did not say much at this moment. He just woke up and sensed the changes in the mysterious power, feeling if there was something that was crossing space and coming over. Millions of years had passed, but Luo Fan's understanding of this power had not improved much. It was still the same as before. At this time, although he was meditating, he still didn't understand anything. That power was still as stable as before. That possibility existed. The existence that was crossing space and coming over could not be sensed at all. While he was in the process of sensing it, this power suddenly started to fluctuate slightly. As the ripples spread out, a figure appeared from nothing, materialized, and gradually appeared on the platform. The moment she saw this figure, Hun-Ku could not help but be pleasantly surprised. There was no other reason than that this person was Sky Maiden from a different timeline. But soon, Hun-Ku's expression became a little unsightly, because she found that Sky Maiden from a different timeline was not the same as before. Instead, she was in an extremely sorry state. She felt as if she had gone through countless battles and had no time to recover before rushing over. At this moment, Luo Fan also frowned. He was also extremely surprised by the changes that had happened to Sky Maiden from a different timeline. Normally speaking, in the Earth universe after the world was shattered and during the Age of Chaos, Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators were considered to be close to the peak. The Sage-to-Be realm was the limit of cultivators. In such an era, even a false sage could be absolutely invincible, let alone Sky Maiden from a different timeline who had surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm. It was impossible for anything or any existence to have an impression of him. Under such a background, Sky Maiden from a different timeline was in such a sorry state, as if she had gone through a terrible battle. How could he not be curious about this situation? Soon enough, the Space Maiden from a different timeline was revealed to the world. Seeing both Luo Fan and Hun-Ku by her side, she could not help but be overjoyed. She said, "It's good that you're here. Hurry up and come with me. There are powerful enemies in the Earth universe. I can't deal with them alone." Hearing this, Luo Fan hurriedly stopped Hun-Ku, who was about to take action. He said, slow down, slow down. Now that we are no longer in the Earth universe, the time there is already relatively independent from here. How long have we been delayed here? None of that will affect the time it takes us to get there. So, you'd better explain things clearly first." Hearing this, the air hostess in the alternate timeline still looked anxious and said, "It's different this time. The enemy this time is from chaos. We don't lack this bit of time." Luo Fan still shook his head and said, "Was this a joke? He didn't know anything and just rushed over like that. Was he waiting to die, or what? If the opponent was as powerful as that wisp of aura that he encountered back then, wouldn't he just be sending himself to the door and be easily taken care of by the opponent?" The Empyrean Maiden in a different timeline saw this. He knew that if Luo Fan didn't know the situation, he would never agree. He could only sigh and tell him the situation. It turned out that when she returned to the Earth universe in her timeline, she discovered that the situation in the Earth universe was no different from when she had left. There were still billions of years until the next era shift, as if time had not passed at all after she had left. She discovered this. Naturally, she felt as if it was a lifetime ago. If it wasn't for her firm mind, she would almost suspect that everything she had experienced in the other world over the years was just an illusion. After that, she began to carry out her plan. She began to preach on Earth and across the universe. She took in thousands of disciples, set up countless secret realms, and opened up countless places for cultivators to cultivate in. She sent all the living beings in the universe who had the aptitude to cultivate into it, and so on and so forth. In just a short period of tens of millions of years, the cultivation level of the Earth universe in that timeline had increased by several levels. Originally, the innate Grand Luo was already the peak. After tens of millions of years, the innate Grand Luo had already become the middle level of the cultivators. Only those in the demi-saint realm could shake them. The strongest existence had even been promoted to the height of the pseudo-saint realm. Because of this kind of promotion, it was no longer appropriate to call that era the age of Dharma ending. Therefore, under the will of the Empyrean from a different timeline, that era was transformed into a brand new era, an era called the Rune Era. The word rune was obviously named after the Tao that the Empyrean from a different timeline cultivated. At that time, the great tribulation of the changing era had descended on the Earth universe. Almost 30% of the stars and 30% of the living beings in the Earth universe had been completely annihilated. As a result, the Empyrean from a different timeline had to spend a lot of effort to hold on. When she told Luo Fan about it, The Empyrean from a different timeline admitted that if it wasn't for the experience of resisting the Great Tribulation with Luo Fan, she would not have been able to hold on during the Great Tribulation of the changing era. In the end, the reincarnation of the era would descend ahead of time and the age of Dharma ending would disappear. However, it was not without its benefits to get through the Great Tribulation of the changing era with great difficulty. At the very least, after the Great Tribulation of the changing era, the entire Earth universe began to change. The rejection of cultivators had completely disappeared. The cultivators who cultivated the Tao of runes received a great boost. In the universe after that, their cultivation speed was several times faster than before. Due to this change, the 30% of the Earth universe that had been lost was quickly made up for with the efforts of many cultivators. Moreover, because the Earth universe was rebuilt from ruins, the recovered planets and living beings were much stronger than before. At the very least, in terms of adapting to cultivation, they were much better than before. Tens of millions of years later, the cultivation world of the Earth universe continued to develop at a speed that was several times stronger than before. Pseudo-sage cultivators continued to emerge like mushrooms after the rain. As the standards of many cultivators continued to rise, the situation of the entire Earth universe changed more and more. The originally barren universe was gradually filled with stronger and stronger vitality. Due to that vitality, countless powerful living beings were born in the void and gave birth to many races in the starry sky. This made the Earth universe completely different from what Luo Fan remembered. Instead, it was more like a universe from fantasy and legends. Just as everything was developing extremely smoothly, the situation changed. After billions of years, when this era was about to end in a few 100 million years, finally, a cultivator broke through one boundary after another and finally began to break through to the pseudo-sage realm. This was a milestone event in the cultivation world. The Air Maiden, who was in a different timeline, was naturally extremely concerned. At that time, she even specially took action to protect this cultivator so that this cultivator could improve more smoothly. Originally, she had thought that, with her own strength, helping a cultivator break through to the pseudo-sage realm should be as simple as saying a few words, and there would definitely not be any problems. Therefore, although she seemed to take it very seriously, she was actually not worried at all that there would be any problems with the other party's breakthrough. However, she did not expect that a problem would still appear in the end. Moreover, as soon as it appeared, it was in an earth-shattering manner, making her feel overwhelmed. This was because the process of that cultivator breaking through to the pseudo-sage realm actually triggered a tribulation. It was something that the Air Maiden of a different timeline had never encountered or even heard of before. The pseudo-sage tribulation. That tribulation almost affected the entire Earth and the universe. At that time, the entire universe fell into that sea of lightning, constantly being bombarded by the lightning and continuously destroyed. If it wasn't for Space Maiden, who was in an alternate timeline, protecting the entire universe, the tribulation itself might have been enough to annihilate the entire universe, killing all the cultivators within it. Such a terrifying tribulation. The cultivator who originally had a high chance of breaking through to the pseudo-sage realm was ultimately unable to make it through. In that tribulation, he turned into dust, leaving no trace of his existence behind. He had been completely erased from this world. As that living being was erased, the entire universe fell into a strange atmosphere. A feeling of despair gradually spread. Which cultivator in the universe could have enough confidence to resist such a terrifying tribulation? Which cultivator felt that they could withstand the terrifying blow and break through to the pseudo-sage realm? Since they didn't have such confidence, didn't that mean that the cultivation of all cultivators was a dead end? It was simply a dead end. The more one cultivated, the closer one was to death. With this kind of thinking, it was only natural that despair would arise. When Luo Fan heard this, he interrupted, "That should be the tide of the era. That era, even after your changes, is not the false saint era, but the rune era. For those cultivators to be able to break through to the false sage stage, they must have already found their own Tao and not the Tao of runes. It would be strange if such a breakthrough didn't trigger a backlash from the tides of the era. Hearing this, the empty lady in the alternate timeline sighed and said, "I've figured out after that, but it was already too late." Luo Fan nodded. He already had some guesses in his heart. However, this was only a guess. As for the specifics, he still had to wait for confirmation. What the air hostess said next from a different timeline verified his guess. Although that tribulation had subsided after the death of the cultivator, it was still not enough. It caused some indescribable changes to the entire Earth's universe, causing the entire Earth's universe to seem to have reached its doomsday in advance. All kinds of indescribable disasters kept erupting everywhere in the universe, causing the entire Earth's universe to become riddled with holes in an extremely short period of time, as if it had already become extremely broken. Those various situations made the air hostess in the alternate timeline wonder if the reincarnation of the era was coming in advance. She couldn't help but feel anxious and began to look for various ways to eliminate the various disasters, stabilize this world, and work hard to delay the arrival of the tides of the era. This kind of effort couldn't be said to be ineffective, but it could only be described as not very effective. Speaking of this, the air hostess in the alternate timeline felt an inexplicable sense of helplessness. Clearly, she still felt rather emotional when she recalled the hard work back then. At that time, it was still a few 100 million years from 5-6 billion years ago, right? Luo Fan asked. That's right. The air hostess in the alternate timeline sighed and nodded, confirming Luo Fan's guess. In that case, the tides of the era were triggered before the time to erupt. I think it will manifest in another form. It's most likely to be with the help of some living being. If that's the case, your injuries. Luo Fan mumbled. Hearing this, the air hostess in the alternate timeline smiled bitterly and said, "You really guessed the answer so quickly." That's right. The way the tides of the era erupted was exactly what you imagined. It summoned some kind of living being from the chaos and threw it into the Earth's universe, causing incomparably complete destruction to the entire universe. It kneaded the planets in the universe like sand and rubbed space-time like a rag. The cultivators that I've cultivated for billions of years were like ants in front of it. They had no ability to resist at all and were destroyed in droves. Even I was almost powerless in front of that living being. If it wasn't for the fact that the living being's intelligence wasn't high, giving me the opportunity to take advantage of it, perhaps I wouldn't be able to appear in front of you now. Chapter 1961. What happened next was obvious. Under the attack of the powerful creature, the Earth in the timeline kept collapsing and dying. Obviously, the empty lady in the timeline wouldn't sit back and watch this happen. Thus, he went up to stop it, to resist that powerful creature. And the final result, Luo Fan and the others had already seen it. That was, the empty lady in the timeline was seriously injured and could only come here to ask for help from Luo Fan. After listening to her, Luo Fan thought for a while, then sighed and said, "Let's go. Although I don't care about your timeline, I don't really care about it. Although I don't care about your timeline, the situation will be different if there's a creature from chaos." He didn't lie and say that he was worried about the empty lady in the timeline and the Earth in the timeline, so he decided to help. Instead, he told her the reason why he was going to help. After all, this reason couldn't be hidden at all. Even if the empty lady in the timeline was deceived for a while, she would definitely come to her senses soon. When that time came, it wouldn't be good. The empty lady in the timeline smiled bitterly when she heard Luo Fan's words. She naturally knew that Luo Fan wouldn't help her or the safety of the timeline. Once he decided to help, there must be a reason related to his own interests, of course. She wasn't a literary young woman. For her, as long as the result was that Luo Fan was willing to help, it was fine. As for the specific reason, it didn't matter. Moreover, at least Luo Fan didn't lie to her. This made her feel more relieved. At that moment, she nodded and said, "Then what are we waiting for? Let's hurry up and go. Maybe that timeline has already been destroyed." Luo Fan just smiled. Then, from his body, another him slowly walked out of it. This was obviously his doppelganger. It seemed that he didn't intend to enter that timeline with his real body, but only his doppelganger. The reason for this was that the creature from chaos was too powerful. Even he didn't have absolute confidence that he could defeat it. Secondly, it was because that timeline was an extremely fragile timeline. Who knew when this timeline would completely collapse under the true sage's choice? Under such circumstances, he had no interest in dying along with that timeline. Fortunately, due to the special nature of Luo Fan's cultivation, the difference between his clone and his original body was not that great. His clone also possessed the power that his original body possessed. Therefore, using a clone to travel through time and space to that timeline didn't have much of an impact on the battle with the creature from the primal chaos. You should also send a clone over. Luo Fan thought for a moment. He turned to Hun Ku and said, as a matter of fact, even Space Maiden from a different timeline was so weak in front of the creature that came from the state of primal chaos. He didn't think that Hun Ku would be of any use if she went. Asking her to go over at this time was more for her to broaden her horizons. Since that was the case, it didn't matter if Hun Ku used her full strength or not. Hearing his words, Hun Ku was slightly stunned. Then, she nodded and also sent out a clone. Space Maiden from a different timeline saw this scene. She couldn't help but have a complicated expression. After all, the Earth universe in that timeline was her home. After all, she had a very close relationship with it. Under such circumstances, seeing how the others were so wary of their hometown, so much so that they weren't even willing to enter it personally, it was easy to imagine how uncomfortable it was for them to feel. However, at this time, she obviously couldn't say anything. After all, the two of them were completely helping her at this time. She couldn't possibly ask them to go into battle naked. What about you? Luo Fan turned to look at Space Maiden from a different timeline and asked, I won't use a clone. That's my home. Space Maiden from a different timeline said. Although she understood Luo Fan and the rest, she wouldn't agree that she was also wary of her own home. She couldn't use a clone to deal with the danger in her home. Hearing this, Hun Ku looked ashamed and said, Then I won't use a clone. I'll go on myself. Space Maiden from a different timeline shook her head and said, No, you can use a clone. Although you're my daughter, that's not your home. That's your home. You don't have to go in yourself. Moreover, you're the heavenly ruler of this world. This place needs you even more. These words made Hun Ku's expression change. Fortunately, she was a celestial Arch after all. She held great authority in this world and possessed unimaginable wisdom. So she quickly figured out that what the Sky Lady said in an alternate timeline was not false. She sighed and said, All right, that's all we can do. Luo Fan didn't say anything to persuade Space Maiden from a different timeline. After all, she had already reached this level. What she should do and how she should choose to bear the danger was up to her own will. Since she was willing to bear this kind of danger, it was her own problem. At that moment, Luo Fan's doppelganger and Hun Ku's doppelganger, together with the real body of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline, started to activate the power of that strange power. Using a stone in the hand of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline as a medium, they started to practice the traces that the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline had left in the Earth's universe over the years. They started to activate the power and move towards the Earth's universe in the alternate timeline. In an instant, the figures of the three of them started to gradually blur on the platform. Boundless and powerful pressure appeared at the same time, acting on their bodies. They could feel their bodies starting to produce all sorts of cracking sounds, as if there were countless cracks appearing in their bodies, and they were constantly being smoothed out. Air hostess from different timelines had already experienced such a situation several times. Luo Fan also had a similar experience. Only Hun Ku had encountered such an experience for the first time. For a moment, the expressions of Luo Fan and the empty lady from a different timeline were still quite relaxed, but their eyes were a little more serious. As for Hun Ku, her expression was constantly changing. The power in her body kept surging, resisting the powerful pressure with great difficulty. She tried hard to maintain her complete existence. The surrounding light and shadow kept changing. Countless worlds and worlds flashed before their eyes. In a trance, the three of them seemed to have passed through endless worlds, boundless space-time, and boundless chaos. In the process of their transmigration, time seemed to have no meaning for them. After an unknown period of time, an incomparably huge and incomparably powerful existence appeared in front of them, causing them to collide with it without any cover or protection. At this moment, the terrifying impact caused Hun, Ku's doppelganger, to tremble. In an instant, it collapsed and turned into smoke, almost completely disappearing. Fortunately, Luo Fan and Space Maiden from a different timeline were watching. At this moment, they acted at the same time. Waves of power shrouded Hun, Ku's collapsing body. At this moment, it was like building blocks, and every single particle began to reassemble. In the blink of an eye, his body had already been completely constructed. The whole process did not even take any time. Hun Ku did not even feel the unimaginable pain before she had completely recovered. It could be said that if it wasn't for her astonishing memory and her unparalleled confidence in her senses, she might have suspected that the process of her body shattering was just an illusion that she had created at the moment of impact. When she came back to her senses, the three of them had already arrived in a boundless, pitch-black void. At this moment, an extremely familiar, yet inexplicable feeling welled up in Luo Fan's heart. In front of him was a boundless, starry sky. It was the feeling that the Earth universe gave him. However, the feeling of the Earth universe was mixed with a kind of rune Dao. However, it was also mixed with a feeling of the rune path. This made it impossible for him to match it with the real Earth universe. It seems that we've arrived. Luo Fan sighed inexplicably. He had never thought that he would one day come to the Earth universe after the world had shattered. However, this was not the timeline that he was in, but another timeline. At this moment, an indescribably terrifying impact was transmitted from an extremely far place that transcended time and space. The entire Earth universe had a radius of trillions of light years. The source of the current fluctuation was in a location that was more than 3 billion light years away. However, the moment the fluctuation erupted, Luo Fan, who was here, had already sensed the existence of the fluctuation. And this was not because of Luo Fan's own outstanding perception ability, but because the fluctuations had really been transmitted from the source to this location over a distance of more than 3 billion light years. Not to mention anything else, a star that was tens of thousands of miles away had already been pushed away from its original trajectory due to the fluctuation. The way it operated was already quite different from before. Is it there? Luo Fan looked in the direction of the fluctuation and asked the empty maiden in the alternate timeline. Yes, it's there. There used to be a dojo that was opened by one of my disciples. It should have been destroyed by now, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline said in a low voice. In that case, not too much time has passed since you left and returned to the Earth universe. It should have only been a few dozen breaths. The empty maiden in the alternate timeline was stunned for a moment before she nodded. It was not difficult for any cultivator to calculate how much time had passed. Moreover, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline was an existence that had even surpassed the supreme Emperor realm. If that's the case, then our appearance will definitely make that creature vigilant. It should find us very soon. Luo Fan just shook his head and said with a smile. Hearing this, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline came to a sudden realization. She nodded and said, "Yes, that's right. I was seriously injured when I was fighting with it, but I completely recovered after a few dozen breaths. Moreover, we appeared so far away from it, so it will definitely be vigilant." As expected, just as her voice fell, an incomparably powerful aura suddenly came crashing over from a faraway place. This aura, it wasn't the kind that would normally spread out and completely envelop the entire Earth and the universe. Instead, it was completely concentrated and turned into a scale that could only cover the three of them. Then it completely crushed the three of them. At this moment, the surrounding lights and shadows changed. Countless heavens and realms suddenly appeared around them. In a trance, it was as if they had been removed from the Earth and the universe in an instant. It was as if they had been brazenly included in an extremely strange group of realms. The powerful pressure didn't just affect the three of them mentally, it also affected their bodies, impacting them and giving them an incomparably huge blow. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan and the Empty Maiden in the alternate timeline did not do anything. However, Han Ku's aura had already been triggered. She began to erupt with a powerful Emperor Realm aura, which formed a fierce collision with the powerful aura around them. Boom, 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 boom. A terrifying impact completely erupted at this moment. Under the impact of these two auras, the surrounding space-time was constantly collapsing and being destroyed. It was constantly collapsing and being destroyed. Terrifying shockwaves were constantly spreading in all directions. More and more realms formed by the auras kept collapsing and being destroyed. The scene was so tragic that it could not be described with words. At this moment, a loud roar was heard by the three of them. At this moment, this roar was only tens of thousands of miles away from them. Although this was still an extremely far distance for ordinary people, for existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, it could be said to be completely face-to-face. Compared to the distance of billions of light years before, it was already a world of difference. As the confrontation of the surrounding auras continued, the countless realms, the scene of countless lights and shadows began to fade gradually. Everything seemed to have completely recovered at this moment. The scene of the boundless void reappeared once again. At this moment, Luo Fan finally saw clearly what that chaotic creature looked like. It was a long snake. It was a long snake that was covered in countless densely packed runes. It looked incomparably hideous, and its eyes were filled with endless, ominous glints. Indistinctly, chaotic luster was constantly flowing in the depths of its eyes. It was several light years long, and its body proportion was not the slightest bit abnormal. It looked incomparably natural. Hence, it could be seen how shocking its size was. It could be said that, in terms of size, it was already very close to Luo Fan and the others who were tens of thousands of miles away. Die. After the huge creature appeared, incomparably terrifying sounds came from its mouth continuously. Its forked tongue kept drilling out from the center of its tightly shut mouth, causing the surrounding space to tremble and collapse continuously as its body squirmed slightly. The nomological laws and even the great Tao shook, producing all sorts of cracks and countless holes. It was an incomparably miserable scene in the void of the universe. It doesn't seem to have much intelligence. Luo Fan sighed. The creature itself was indeed incomparably powerful. In fact, it felt like it was many times stronger than him, who had already gone through 3 major tribulations and was about to face the 4th one. Facing it, even Luo Fan didn't have much confidence that he could resist it with just his strength alone. However, compared to its incomparably terrifying power, its intelligence was so insignificant. It felt like even an ordinary person could completely crush it in terms of intelligence at this moment. The long snake suddenly opened its mouth, and a large amount of grayish, chaotic airflow gushed out of its mouth, covering the sky and earth as it smashed towards Luo Fan. This mass of chaotic airflow was not truly chaotic, but contained extremely strong chaotic characteristics. However, it contained extremely strong chaotic characteristics. As soon as it charged out of the snake's mouth, it had already crushed the surrounding space-time, causing the great Tao of the Earth's universe to seem to have been completely broken and shattered. It could no longer produce any effect in this area. As for the chaotic air current itself, it continued to disintegrate and transform as it charged forward, splitting into countless time, space, matter, and energy. It squeezed into the shattered space and time around it in an incomparably explosive manner, pushing the already shattered laws one step further into the chaotic abyss, causing the surrounding chaos to become even more unfathomable. At this moment, Luo Fan remained unfazed in the face of such a terrifying impact. With a thought, he grabbed Han Ku and Space Maiden from an alternate timeline and took a step forward. A path of light extended from his feet, twisting and changing in the void, flashing and shuttling. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the chaotic airflow and arrived at the head of the long snake, appearing between its eyebrows. As soon as the path of light appeared, Luo Fan and the other two appeared at the end of the path of light at the same time. In other words, they appeared between the long snake's eyebrows. Chapter 1962. In any case, Luo Fan had already arrived at the spot between the primal chaos snake's eyebrows. The length of the chaos serpent must be measured in light years. Under such circumstances, even though the place where Luo Fan was at the center of the chaos serpent's eyebrows, from the perspective of ordinary living beings, he seemed to be boundless. In fact, those two protruding eyes were like two incomparably huge planets, overlooking everything on the earth from the extremely distant end of the world. There were countless runes on the body of this primordial chaos snake. It was completely similar to Space Maiden's Tao of Runes in a different timeline. It was as if it had been abstracted from Space Maiden's Tao of Runes and had undergone some mysterious changes. Such a situation in itself seemed to be extremely inconceivable, and it was sufficient to cause anyone to be unable to wrap their heads around it. However, with Luo Fan's deeper and deeper understanding of the state of chaos, he understood what was going on at a glance. The state of chaos itself was an existence that was fundamentally different from a world. In it, space-time dimensions, timelines, and different futures were all the same. In any world, in any timeline, in any space-time dimension, the state of primal chaos encountered was the same state of primal chaos. The reason why different timelines, different space-time dimensions, and even different futures had different manifestations of the chaos was because those manifestations were caused by the interaction between heaven and earth, space-time dimensions, the future, and the chaos. If this were to be placed in the timeline of the Earth universe, this primordial serpent in front of him seemed to have been born naturally in the state of primordial chaos. However, in reality, its appearance was completely formed by the interaction between the chaotic state and this timeline. In other words, it was because of the situation in the Earth's universe in this timeline that the chaos snake appeared. In this way, the primordial chaos serpent. Naturally, it had the characteristics of the Earth universe in this timeline. The Earth universe that had been transformed by Space Maiden in an alternate timeline was obviously the Earth universe that was dominated by the Path of Runes. Because of this, the primal chaos serpent was born. Naturally, there were traces of the Tao of Runes on his body. Therefore, it was only natural for so many runes to appear on his body. All of this merely flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he put it aside. It didn't matter what the reason was. In any case, he had already confirmed that this chaos-long snake was his enemy. What he needed to do next was to defeat it. Apart from this, there was no other choice. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly raised his hand and pointed at the center of the snake's eyebrows. A mysterious power of the laws instantly surged out of his hand and condensed in the void. It directly transformed into a huge, sharp blade that copied and compressed all the concepts of sharpness in the universe. After that, it suddenly stabbed into the center of the snake's eyebrows. Kacha, kacha, kacha. Endless, terrifying explosions erupted from the point of contact between the sharp blade and the snakeskin armor. Endless shock waves were generated wave after wave, constantly spreading in all directions, like ripples formed by concentric circles, constantly surging in all directions. The Chaos Long Snake's armor was many times stronger than what Luo Fan had imagined. The sharp blade, which copied all the concepts of sharpness in the universe and was completely condensed by the power of the laws, did not produce any tangible results when facing the armor. Under the recoil of the armor, the sharp blade collapsed bit by bit. Instead, it crumbled bit by bit. Countless fragments of the sharp blades turned into smoke and scattered in all directions. They were taken away by the countless shock waves. Beneath this, there was only a white spot on the armor. There was only a white dot on the leather armor, and the white dot had completely disappeared when the shock wave brushed past it. The gap is actually so big. Luo Fan thought to himself in horror. At this moment, the countless runes on the surface of the Chaos Long Snake's body began to surge, turning into waves that pressed towards Luo Fan from all directions. This kind of momentum and terror was as if all the seawater in a perfect world had been compressed in an instant and was crushing towards him. In the face of such an impact, Luo Fan let out a loud roar. Endless law power swarmed out and began to penetrate into the endless waves around him. He began to guide the power of these waves with a purpose, causing the power of these waves to gradually change direction under his guidance. From the original target of Luo Fan, it brazenly changed to the center of Luo Fan's eyebrows. Although it was called a wave, it was actually endless runes. These runes were more mysterious and complicated than the runes of the Great Path. It could be said that if any rune was thrown into a world without any cultivators, it would be enough to cause an earth-shattering change in that world. It would cause a cultivation civilization to be born from nothing, and it might even be able to nurture powerful cultivators who had reached the false sage stage. The terrifying power of such a rune was self-evident. Just like that, they covered the heavens and the earth, and countless trillions of them were densely packed together. It was obvious how shocking the effect would be. Under the impact of the runes, the space between the eyebrows of the primal chaos snake, which was unscathed by Luo Fan's sharp blade, suddenly trembled. The leather armor seemed to have been eroded by the wind and began to collapse. In the blink of an eye, the flesh and blood inside were completely exposed. Although the Chaos Long Snake lacked intelligence, it still had instincts after all. Seeing that its own power had caused so much damage to itself, its movements immediately paused. The countless runes that were about to continue drilling into its flesh and continue to destroy its flesh and even endanger its life suddenly stopped. As they collapsed, they continuously scattered and gradually turned back into the original runes that covered its body again. Of course, these were the results of the runes that were still under the control of the Chaos Long Snake. One had to know that the means that Luo Fan had used just now were not illusions. Although those runes were the power of the Chaos Long Snake itself, under Luo Fan's full control, there were finally some runes. They had truly broken free from the other party's control and were now under his control. Therefore, although most of the runes had already collapsed and returned to their original positions, there were still a large number of runes that were like a long river under Luo Fan's control. It continued to drill into the broken leather armor, continuously destroying the flesh and blood of the long snake. At this moment, the long snake let out an incomparably mournful scream. As it screamed, its body kept churning, constantly shattering the surrounding space. As for the many nearby stars, they were inevitably turned into nothingness. Such a scene made Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, feel heartache and helpless. She could only continuously move some planets with living beings away and place them in a safe place. However, this was only a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. The Chaos Serpent was so huge that it collided with too many stars in a single roll. Its rolling speed was so fast that even though Space Maiden from an alternate timeline was so powerful, she could only move a small number of stars away in a short period of time. For most of the planets, however, he could only watch helplessly as the primal chaos snake crushed him. So powerful. I didn't expect there to be such a creature. Hunku was extremely shocked by the power of the Chaos Long Snake while helping Space Maiden in a different timeline. Although she was already a celestial the arch of a world, and her cultivation realm had reached a level that was close to surpassing the Supreme Emperor realm, she had never seen such a terrifying creature before. However, she had never seen such a terrifying creature. She could sense that the creature in front of her was at least tens of millions of times stronger than her. If she were to fight it, not to mention the clone in front of her, even if her main body was in that world and had absolute control over it, she would not be able to gain any advantage. In fact, she might not even be able to get close to it. Before this, she had never imagined that such a powerful creature would actually exist in this world. At this moment, she suddenly felt glad that she had insisted on coming here with her mother. At this moment, Luo Fan did not feel good either. Although he was using the runes on the Chaos Long Snake's body to continuously hurt it, this did not mean that he was not consuming his own power. On the contrary, every time he manipulated the runes, his law power would be consumed several times. Every rune was struggling frantically in his hands. They were trying their best to return to their owner's control and merge with the endless runes. This required him to use all his power to suppress and influence the runes. Once he relaxed even a little, the endless runes would return to the Chaos Long Snake's body. While he was exhausting his law power, he had to endure the Chaos Long Snake's intense struggle and the terrifying impact that the Chaos Long Snake had set up to shatter time and space and completely shatter the nomological laws. It went without saying how it felt. It could be said that he no longer had any spare energy to pay attention to the outside world. He could only wholeheartedly manipulate the runes to penetrate the Chaos Long Snake's head and do everything possible to destroy the insides of its body. That primal Chaos Serpent was simply too huge. Its scalp was hundreds of millions of miles long. Even though the power he was manipulating was extremely powerful, it would still take a long time for Luo Fan to break through its scalp and injure its internal organs. The Chaos Long Snake kept thrashing about, trying its best to alleviate the pain caused by the hole in its forehead. At the same time, it instinctively began to manipulate the endless power to gather at its forehead and quickly break through its wound. It appeared in front of the huge pit and pounced towards Luo Fan in an overwhelming manner. Although this was only power, it contained boundless vitality and endless battle instincts. It was like many living creatures had formed an army and were charging towards Luo Fan in a frenzy. The light figures formed by these powers were all in the shape of humans. Some were tall, some were short, some were fat, and some were thin. Some were extremely large, while others were extremely small. The many living creatures gathered together seemed to form countless torrents. The momentum was so huge that it was truly earth-shattering. In such a situation, how could Luo Fan not sense it? At that moment, he focused his mind with great difficulty and separated himself from manipulating the runes and resisting the changes in time and space around him. He then looked towards the endless power. The number of living creatures formed by these powers was extremely high. Just a glance was enough to tell that there were at least trillions of them. There were so many living creatures. Although their intelligence wasn't that great, their combat instincts were extremely strong. As they pounced over, they instinctively chose the most rigorous and perfect method. As they converged, the surrounding time and space were constantly changing like plasticine under their control. They turned into all sorts of indescribably terrifying powers that recreated time and space, worlds, and lands. Faced with such an attack, Luo Fan let out a long sigh of relief. The attack seemed extremely powerful and could destroy all cultivators and all powerhouses. However, in his eyes, compared to the attack of the Chaos Long Snake that directly spat out the chaos air, it was much easier to deal with. There was no other reason for this. Even though there were many living beings formed from the countless powers in front of him, and they were also quite powerful, they did not have much intelligence, which was enough for him to easily steal their powers and use them to attack other living beings. In this way, the more living creatures there were, the more advantageous it would be for him. Moreover, although these living creatures were powerful, they were only equivalent to ordinary cultivators. However, that was only equivalent to an ordinary cultivator. To him, a single slap from him was enough to kill tens of thousands of these living beings, due to these various reasons. It was naturally relatively easy for him to deal with these living creatures. The truth was just as he had expected. Luo Fan had easily grasped the weaknesses of these creatures. He did not even need to make many moves to seize more than half of the creature's power. With a turn of the direction, he diverted the countless attacks in another direction and threw them at the remaining living creatures. An earth-shattering explosion occurred at this moment. The countless living creatures collapsed under the impact and turned back into power. They began to shatter bit by bit and finally collapsed completely. Before he knew it, they had already disappeared without a trace, however. Before Luo Fan could heave a sigh of relief, even more living creatures were born and continued to pounce at him from all directions, as expected of living creatures without much intelligence. They clearly know that this kind of attack is ineffective, but they still want to continue. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, but his movements didn't slow down in the slightest. He continued to manipulate the power of those creatures like before, and with a turn, he once again went towards other creatures and once again exterminated them. Just as Luo Fan had expected, the same attack appeared again after that. The scene was just like the previous one. They were destroyed once again. Just like that, one cycle after another, reincarnation after reincarnation continued in the deep pit between his brows. When Luo Fan had already penetrated tens of thousands of miles with the sharp blade formed by the runes and arrived before the long snake's skull, the cycle had already continued for hundreds of millions of times. To Luo Fan, each cycle was just a matter of a few thoughts and actions. It seemed extremely simple. However, as the cycle continued, his expression gradually changed. From the initial relaxed and disdainful look, it gradually turned solemn. There was no other reason. It was because he realized that every time those living creatures were destroyed, there would be some extremely subtle changes when they were born again. This kind of change was so insignificant that even he would overlook it if he didn't pay close attention. However, as the changes continued to accumulate, after hundreds of millions of times, the changes had accumulated to a point that no one could ignore them anymore. Up until now, although Luo Fan was still able to destroy those creatures, the amount of energy he needed to do so was more than twice as much as before. This was naturally not a big deal if it was under normal circumstances. But in this situation where his energy to deal with these living beings was completely derived from squeezing out his own mind, he was gradually beginning to feel pressured. The skull was something that was even harder than the leather armor on the surface. Compared to the leather armor, it was much more difficult to penetrate the skull. Even with the runes that came with the Chaos Snake, Luo Fan's speed had suddenly slowed down by thousands of times. If he was said to be riding a rocket previously, his speed now was like taking a stroll. This difference caused the number of attacks he encountered to soar by more than 10 times as compared to before. He could predict that the number of attacks he had to encounter from here to penetrate the Chaos Snake skull would definitely be more than 10 times as compared to before. According to the increase in the number of attacks, it was obvious that things would not go so smoothly. Although it doesn't have much intelligence, I didn't expect its combat instinct to be able to adjust and improve its attacks at any time. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became increasingly solemn. Chapter 1963. At this moment, Luo Fan knew that he couldn't continue like this. If this continued, the only thing that awaited him was failure. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration. He thought of an ability that he had never used since he obtained it. His heart stirred slightly, and the world in his eyes suddenly changed. From the original normal perspective, it began to rise to an extremely high level. Gradually, it surpassed reality and the universe. In a mysterious way, it broke into an indescribable level. At the conceptual level, the moment he arrived, he discovered that his concept of existence, which was a ball with a ring, had brazenly stepped into an incomparably huge concept of existence. This incomparably huge concept of existence was even larger than the concept of existence of the third tribulation that he had encountered. Moreover, in terms of the degree of condensation of the concept, this concept of existence was even more condensed than the concept of existence of the third tribulation. Under such a concept of existence, his own concept of existence was under much greater pressure than the concept of existence in the third great tribulation. At this moment, the surrounding concepts of existence were constantly rushing towards his concept of existence, splitting into countless tiny concepts of existence to attack his concept of existence that seemed to be like a world of laws. In this conflict, his concept of existence completely collapsed and perished. On the other hand, the massive concepts around him didn't suffer much damage. No matter how many of the smaller concepts were destroyed or failed, they continued to split off concepts from all directions to charge at him, continuing to attack him. Moreover, after each wave of concept of existence was eliminated, the newly born concept of existence would vaguely absorb some peculiar characteristics from the surrounding concepts of existence, becoming more solid and powerful and influencing Luo Fan's concept of existence. Then it grew bigger and bigger. It could be imagined that if this continued, there would come a day when these existences would be able to exist. It would definitely be strong enough to shake Luo Fan's concept of existence that had already been reinforced by the worldview of laws. Then it would truly endanger his existence. As expected of a creature born from a state of chaos, Luo Fan couldn't help but be shocked at the sight of such a huge existence. The concept of an existence that was even more powerful than the third great tribulation that he had encountered back then was not something that any living being could achieve. He even suspected that in terms of quantity, it might not be much worse than a true sage. However, it was just a matter of quantity. With the support of the worldview, Luo Fan's concept of existence had reached an indescribable height in terms of quality. Although the massive concepts of existence around him were also considerable in terms of quality, there was still a huge gap when compared to Luo Fan's concept of existence. With a thought, Luo Fan changed the direction of his concept of existence. He stopped at the surface of the gigantic concept and rushed towards the center of the concept. Amidst the impact, the surrounding concept of existence began to surge rapidly. A powerful shock wave began to spread in all directions from the point of impact, causing Luo Fan's concept of existence to gradually penetrate deep into it. Gradually, it moved towards the core of the huge concept of existence. The concept of existence itself was not like plasticine, but an extremely brittle and hard existence. Such an existence, once it was breached, those who couldn't bear to be breached would naturally collapse, and it would be difficult for them to remain. The damage of this concept of existence. For the huge, chaotic snake, it was a more serious injury than the destruction of its physical body. Even though the chaotic snake's perspective could not reach the conceptual level, it instinctively felt that its concept of existence was suffering a huge blow. However, he also instinctively felt that his existence itself was suffering a huge blow. For a moment, he struggled even more intensely. In reality, between its eyebrows, Luo Fan, who had already penetrated deep into its skull, suffered the attacks of several times more living beings than before. In the face of such a situation, in reality, Luo Fan just closed his eyes tightly. There was only a mysterious magic power of laws slowly circulating around his body in a way similar to the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Inside, the power of the spiritual treasure embryo was only supporting his body, but he did not retaliate at all as he withstood the attacks of the countless living beings. Under such changes, layer after layer of ripples appeared on Luo Fan's body, and crackling sounds constantly erupted from his body. Although the countless living beings were much weaker than Luo Fan, there was still an endless number of them. The attacks continued to stack and crush him, and in the end, the magic power on the surface of his body gradually collapsed, turning into specks of light that scattered in all directions. As for the power of the spiritual treasure embryo, it had also started to violently tremble, as if it was being continuously hammered. However, it was a spiritual treasure embryo, after all. Compared to ordinary objects and magic treasures, the essence of the spiritual treasure embryo was still stronger. In the end, the damage was much smaller than that of Luo Fan's magic power of laws. After dozens of days, when Luo Fan's magic power of laws had completely shattered under the countless impacts, the power of the spiritual treasure embryo was still stable. It was just that there were many cracks on it, but it did not completely dissipate like the magic power of laws. However, compared to the remarkable achievements of the beings transformed from countless powers in reality, What was happening at the conceptual level at this moment was the complete opposite process. Under the impact of Luo Fan's concept of existence, the huge chaos snake's concept of existence collapsed bit by bit, and a larger and larger channel was dug out, leading to the core of the chaos snake's concept of existence. After dozens of days, Luo Fan's concept of existence, which was like a ball with a ring, had completely penetrated into the concept of existence of the chaos snake. He could even vaguely feel that its core was already not far away from him. This situation meant that he wasn't far from true success. At this moment, the chaos snake's survival instinct urged it to start attacking Luo Fan frantically. This time, he did not know that the countless living beings derived from the countless forces were constantly attacking him in reality. Even the flesh and bones around him were breaking away from his original body bit by bit. Countless living beings began to emerge and join the force, constantly pouncing on him. In this way, the situation in reality seemed to become more and more dangerous and difficult to control. However, Luo Fan did not care about all of this at all. He was just constantly attacking the huge concept of existence of the chaos snake on the conceptual level. This was a matter of course. For Luo Fan, no matter what kind of damage his body suffered in reality, no matter how strong or weak he was, no matter how his body was broken in the end, as long as his concept of existence was not damaged, then his life would not be damaged, and everything in reality could be restored at any time according to his will. Under such circumstances, why did he need to worry about his body in reality? Naturally, he only needed to put up a preliminary defense and seize the time to deal with the chaos snake on the conceptual level. His concept of existence was strengthened by the worldview of laws. Although there was still no way to derive the power of laws on the conceptual level, because of its sturdiness, it could already be used as a weapon. Faced with the concept of existence of the chaos snake, it was like a fat pig facing a butcher's sharp knife. It would really get hurt if it was grazed, and it would bleed if it was touched. Under the impact, the concept of existence of the chaos snake continued to dissipate and disappear, and so on and so forth. After a few days, Luo Fan suddenly felt that his concept of existence had collided with an extremely tough existence. This existence was also a concept of existence. However, compared to the concept of existence outside, it was 10 times more condensed and pure. On it, there were countless tiny concepts flowing out and entering the huge concept of existence around it. They were like silk threads deeply inserted into the endless concept of existence around it. They were strung together bit by bit. As a result, the huge concept of existence became a complete whole. In other words, this was the core of the entire huge concept of existence. As long as the core of this concept was completely shattered, the entire concept of existence would collapse and turn into countless tiny concepts of existence. In that case, it would obviously be many times easier to deal with it. Understanding this, Luo Fan naturally did not hesitate anymore. With a slight thought, his concept of existence, which was similar to the worldview of laws, was like a meteor hammer. It flashed through a mysterious trajectory and brazenly collided with the core of the concept of existence. Although the core was tough and powerful, it was obviously still much weaker than Luo Fan's concept of existence that had been strengthened by the worldview of laws. At this time, it finally couldn't withstand the impact that was strengthened by profound combat skills. Countless cracks began to spread in all directions from the point of impact, gradually enveloping the core of the entire concept of existence. As time passed, the countless cracks became bigger and bigger. In the end, the entire core was completely penetrated. Then, it turned into countless fragments and collapsed with a loud bang. As the fragments dispersed, the primal chaos serpent let out an incomparably mournful scream in reality. Countless cracks appeared on its body that was calculated in terms of light years, completely enveloping the entire primal chaos serpent. In the end, the cracks deepened and enlarged, and finally, The primal chaos serpent was directly divided into countless trillions of parts that exploded in all directions like a bomb that had been detonated. These countless pieces of flesh and blood squirmed and evolved continuously in midair. The larger ones had already turned into huge creatures in midair, while the smaller ones had turned into relatively smaller creatures. They began to cover the entire Earth and continue the mission of the primal chaos serpent, which was to destroy the entire Earth and universe. The primal chaos serpent itself was so powerful that its concept of existence alone was already stronger than the third tribulation that Luo Fan had encountered. One could imagine how powerful it was. Now, even though it had collapsed and turned into countless trillions of creatures, the strongest of these creatures were even comparable to the level of the Supreme Emperor. Some of them even faintly surpassed the level of the Supreme Emperor and were comparable to Hun Ku's main body. Even the weaker ones were at least at the immortal realm. The reason why he couldn't easily get rid of Luo Fan or the Empty Lady from an alternate timeline was because his intelligence was truly worrying. However, it did not mean that he was not strong. Just like that, it went from a fraction to billions of trillions. The situation seemed to be countless times more serious than before. However, Air Maiden and Hun Ku, who were watching from a different timeline, were delighted at the same time, because to them, the situation in front of them was like this. Compared to the huge primal chaos snake from before, it was much easier to deal with. Even though there were many of them, these living beings were all extremely powerful. However, they had already fallen to a level that they could deal with. Compared to the previous situation where he couldn't even penetrate the defense of the Chaos Snake's leather armor and couldn't really hurt it at all, it was already countless times better. More importantly, at the level of Air Maidens in an alternate timeline, quantity was no longer a problem. As long as they could deal with the living beings, no matter how many there were, they had enough ways to deal with them. At that moment, they pounced toward the billions of living beings with faces full of surprise. Divine abilities danced in the air, and their power spread out in all directions, shattering and annihilating the living beings. The countless living beings disintegrated, their flesh and blood, and their power constantly fused into the void of the universe to make up for the shattered space-time and laws that had previously been destroyed. Under such changes, more than half of the universe that had been shattered to the point of almost returning to a chaotic state began to gradually recover. Furthermore, all kinds of indescribable life force were gradually born in this starry sky. Obviously, no matter how fast Air Maiden and Hun Ku were, it was impossible for them to completely kill the billions of living beings before they dispersed. Therefore, what the two of them were dealing with were obviously the many powerful living beings that no one outside could fight against. They let go of those living beings below the false saint level, allowing them to disperse towards the entire Earth's universe. Although living beings above the false saint level would cause incomparably great damage to the entire Earth's universe, after being nurtured by Air Maiden in an alternate timeline, there were still some cultivators who could deal with them. At this moment, on the conceptual level, around Luo Fan's concept of existence, the huge concept of the primal chaos snake had already disintegrated into billions of fragments. And these fragments, as reflected in reality, took the initiative to turn into perfection after disintegrating, becoming brand new individuals, and began to collapse in all directions. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan did not hesitate to leave this conceptual level and return to his body. After returning, he saw that the huge primal chaos snake had completely disappeared. Replacing it were countless strange living beings that had gathered into the form of the primal chaos snake and began to scatter in all directions crazily. Fortunately, I'm still in time. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. With a thought, he lifted his foot and stepped down, brazenly stepping in the direction of the primal chaos snake's skull. Along the way, whenever there were living beings that blocked his path, he would casually use his power of laws to wipe them out. As for the living beings that did not block his path, he completely ignored them, treating them as if they did not exist at all. Not long after, he arrived at an area with an obvious gap between the boundary layers. There were still countless living beings in this area. However, these living beings were different from those outside. Their bodies were much weaker, but their spiritual gods were much stronger than those outside. These were none other than the countless living beings that the primal chaos snake's brain had mentioned. If I want to extract all the memories, I have to do this. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Endless power of laws erupted from his body at this moment and began to cover the endless living beings in front of him. In an instant, the living beings that came into contact with his power of laws exploded one by one, turning into countless forces that remained in place like smoke, rolling slightly as if they were still thinking. Given the strength of Luo Fan's power of laws, these living beings that were at most at the false age level could not resist it at all. At this moment, facing the suppression of his power of laws, none of the countless living beings had the slightest ability to resist. In just a few dozen breaths, this place had completely turned into a large sea of smoke, rolling slightly and vaguely looking like a brain. His movements were really fast. Under his intimidation, the many living beings could not escape far at all. At this moment, their location should still be roughly where they were when they merged into one. Chapter 1964. They had lost their sentience and power, and they had split into the body parts of the primal chaos snake. How could Luo Fan put up any resistance against them? In the short span of a few dozen breaths, they had all been swallowed into the soul treasure embryo. In other words, they were inside the mirror. After they were swallowed, countless wisps of smoke began to gather between the starry sky and the world inside the spiritual treasure embryo. After that, they gradually compressed and closed up again. Not long after, it had already condensed into an incomparably huge brain that was so huge that it could even be calculated in light years. The brain was so detailed that even the smallest details had completely restored the appearance of the primal chaos snake's brain before the numerous living beings had appeared. The only difference was that the original primal chaos snake's brain had enough vitality, but the brain in front of him did not have any vitality at all. Looking at the dead brain, Luo Fan only had a faint smile on his face. With a slight thought, he stepped out of the circle of countless living beings and came to a place where he could see the inside of the circle, where Space Maiden and Han Ke from an alternate timeline were fighting the numerous living beings with all their might. The Empyrean Maiden and Han Ke from the alternate timeline were only clones. Compared to their real bodies, they were much weaker. However, compared to the billions of living beings that had been separated from the Chaos Snake, they were much more powerful. Under such circumstances, the countless living beings in front of them could not resist at all. With a single slap, a large number of them died. With a single collision, another large number of them died. Although there were countless living beings, they could not resist at all. If this went on, there would be a day when all the living beings would be completely wiped out. At this moment, in various parts of the Earth's universe, battles began to break out one after another. Those battles took place between the countless living beings that had been separated from the primal chaos snake and the countless living beings that had been nurtured by Space Maiden from an alternate timeline in the Earth's universe. Compared to the one-sided battle on this side, the battles on the other side were countless times more intense. It was also in all directions that it was discovered that these living beings were indeed extremely powerful. They were indeed living beings that could destroy the world. Stars, continents that revolved in the starry sky, great worlds, medium-class worlds. In the minor chiliocosm, the stars, the giant interstellar creatures that supported the islands and continents were all turned into powder in this battle, disappearing without a trace. Who knew how many powerful cultivators had paid with their lives in the battle against the creature, dying and disappearing? His soul dispersed. During this period, there were countless impassioned and tragic songs, countless heroic sons and daughters, and countless wonderful events that could move even a stone-hearted person to tears took place all over the Earth and the universe. In the beginning, the cultivators of the Earth universe were not prepared enough. Their various means were not targeted enough against those living beings. Therefore, They were defeated again and again. More and more stars and worlds were destroyed in this kind of war. But as time went on, as the battle scenes continued to be compiled, the characteristics of the creatures were gradually discovered, and their weaknesses were gradually revealed to the cultivators. In this way, they were fighting. They gradually regained the upper hand. Although they still could not stop the destruction of the Earth universe by those living beings, they could not stop the complete destruction of planets, worlds, and continents. However, they were still able to delay it, causing the battle scene to gradually change from a one-sided situation to a situation where some came and went looking at the scene in front of him. Luo Fan only sighed inwardly, but he had no intention of participating at all. Although this was the Earth universe, it was not the Earth universe that was on the same timeline as Luo Fan's. Moreover, after such a great transformation by Space Maiden in a different timeline, it no longer retained many traces that Luo Fan was familiar with. Under such circumstances, it was difficult for Luo Fan to have too many feelings for this Earth universe. Without too many feelings, he naturally would not be too moved by this. Naturally, he would not help the Earth universe resist the endless living beings that had been split from the primal chaos serpent out of sympathy and pity. Even so, it wasn't difficult for him to deal with these living beings. After watching for a while, he had an idea. He lifted his feet and took a light stride, arriving in the Milky Way and in front of the solar system. Unfortunately, he did not find the planet that he was familiar with here. Even the sun had expanded and turned into a huge red giant, directly enveloping the entire solar system. Even the stars that were originally there were swallowed into it, leaving no trace of the existence of a planet. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Sure enough, this was not the Earth universe that he was familiar with. With this thought in mind, he directly stepped into the red giant and arrived at the place where Earth had been. This place was naturally filled with endless flames at this moment. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's heart jolted. The surrounding flames began to naturally separate, gradually creating a gap that was the size of Earth. Shortly after, a piece of land appeared out of thin air in the middle. The shape of this piece of land was not regular. Instead, it looked like the word door. It was the shape of the land on Earth. After building this piece of land, Luo Fan sighed again. Then he stepped onto the land and randomly picked a spot to sit cross-legged. Not to mention Luo Fan, it was extremely easy for any Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivator to open up a gap inside the red giant to accommodate such a piece of land. Now that Luo Fan had done this, there was naturally nothing much to say. Sensing the familiar feeling that came from a long time ago, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile on his face. However, that was all it could do. Subsequently, he took out his spirit treasure embryo and began to look at the chaos serpent's brain that he had just condensed. This brain was the fundamental reason why he followed the empty lady from an alternate timeline to the Earth universe of this timeline. To be more precise, it was not this brain, but the memories contained in this brain. The memories that belonged to the Chaos Serpent were the fundamental reason why he came to this Earth universe. Now that he had obtained this brain, the most important thing was, of course, to extract the memories from it. Fortunately, although the Chaos Serpent was incomparably powerful, it was ultimately not intelligent enough. Even if this brain had a defense, it was only an instinctive defense. If he wanted to break through it, he did not have to worry about the backlash. Immediately, Luo Fan's eyes focused. A stream of light was triggered from the spirit treasure embryo. It rushed out from the depths of the starry sky inside the spirit treasure embryo and headed toward the huge brain that was between heaven and earth. The brain was completely dead. How could it resist? The stream of light poured into the brain without any concealment. As the stream of light poured in, the brain trembled slightly. This tremble caused an indescribable ripple to appear in the surroundings and spread out in all directions. Fortunately, this was the inside of the spirit treasure embryo. Its sturdiness had reached an unimaginable level. That was why it did not react to the wave at all and did not cause space-time to shatter because of the wave. If it was somewhere else, such as in this Earth universe, the situation would not have been like this. In this instant, space-time within a few light years would have completely collapsed due to the wave. At the very least, it would have been completely changed into a completely different appearance. However, if it didn't happen, then it didn't happen. Luo Fan naturally wouldn't worry about this kind of thing that didn't happen. At this moment, he just continuously stimulated the power of the spirit treasure embryo, causing streams of light to be triggered from the depths of the starry sky. They began to continuously penetrate space-time and pour into the brain, causing it to tremble again and again. Wave after wave of energy fluctuations erupted from it. As the tremors appeared again and again, the brain, which was originally as cold as a pile of dead meat, faintly revealed an inexplicable vitality. This vitality was extremely weak. It even made people feel like it was just an illusion. However, it was still there after all, and those shocks came again and again. It was more like the wriggling of the brain after it regained its vitality. The number of streams of light that crashed into the brain kept increasing. Unknowingly, it had already reached trillions. Normally speaking, such a number of streams of light would even be enough to drown the entire Earth universe. However, at this moment, it only caused the vitality in the brain to increase by a little. At a certain moment, Luo Fan lightly shouted, "Rise!" From the spirit treasure embryo, a sun condensed from streams of light appeared out of thin air. After this sun appeared, it began to fall from the sky like a meteor. Gradually, it came crashing down from the highest point in the sky towards the brain that was measured in light years. In the blink of an eye, the sun collided with the brain. During this collision, the sun completely penetrated into the brain. An extremely powerful shock wave was released from the brain, causing it to tremble uncontrollably. This kind of trembling was fundamentally different from the trembling that had occurred over and over again for an unknown amount of time. The tremor from before was like the tremor of a dead pig being patted by someone. This time, however, the trembling was like the trembling of a heart that had regained its vitality. The first trembling was from the outside to the inside. As for the latter, it was a kind of tremor that came from the inside out. Amidst this trembling, specks of light gradually appeared on the surface of the brain. Under this light, there were specks of light flowing across the surface of the brain at an extremely fast speed. Sizzling sounds could be faintly heard coming from within a brain. It was as if some kind of incomparably strange machine was gradually being activated during this process, and it gradually began to operate. At this moment, Luo Fan no longer made any movements. He just sat cross-legged in front of the mirror. His mind was locked onto the brain, and he paid close attention to all the changes in the brain. For the first time in a long time, the spirit treasure embryo did not flash with flowing light. At this moment, it actually seemed a little dim. In this darkness, every time the light on the brain flickered, the entire world would suddenly light up. It was as if a bolt of lightning had suddenly streaked across the sky. This went on for an unknown amount of time. The entire brain finally shone brightly. An indescribable suction force began to be released from the brain, grabbing all the power that existed in the surroundings. All the energy wanted to absorb and devour everything into the brain. If this was the outside world, even Luo Fan would not be able to stop this change at this moment. But at this moment, the brain was in the spirit treasure embryo. All the power and energy inside was the spirit treasure embryo's own power and energy. Under such circumstances, if the spirit treasure embryo wanted to absorb the surrounding power and energy, it was equivalent to forcibly cutting off the flesh of the spirit treasure embryo. How is this possible? At this moment, all the suction force generated by the brain was frantically pulling and pulling, but in the end, it was to no avail. In the end, not even the slightest fluctuation could be stirred up, let alone any power or energy source. The brain worked hard for a long time without any results. In the end, it could only begin to compress itself. The brain, which was originally calculated in light years, was compressed several times in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, it had already been compressed several times, and in the blink of an eye, it was compressed several times again. As it was compressed, the compressed part began to release a huge amount of power and began to supplement the parts that were not compressed. Gradually, the light released from the brain began to become brighter and brighter. Faintly, the phantom of a long snake gradually appeared around the brain, as if it was about to condense again. It seems that I have succeeded. Seeing this, Luo Fan showed a smile on his face. With a thought, he had already stepped into the spirit treasure embryo and arrived in front of the brain. At this moment, the huge phantom of the long snake suddenly raised its head and looked at him. His eyes were filled with an incomparably ferocious and hateful light. Faintly, there was a strong killing intent being generated from his body and surging towards Luo Fan. Seeing this, Luo Fan just smiled. He raised his hand slightly. Then, he grabbed at the huge phantom of the long snake. In the blink of an eye, the endless power inside the spirit treasure embryo began to gather, directly forming a huge hand that was calculated in light years around the huge phantom of the chaos snake. With a slight pause, the hand had already caught the phantom of the long snake in its hand. Then, it suddenly exerted force and crushed the phantom of the long snake. Amidst an extremely shrill scream, only the brain, which had shrunk by more than 10 times, was left between the huge hand formed by power. At this time, this brain was still constantly flashing with light, still revealing various emotions, wanting to fight against Luo Fan. However, under the huge hand, all of this was futile. Luo Fan manipulated the huge hand and pulled the brain in front of him. With a thought, the space inside the spirit treasure embryo began to change subtly. The originally huge brain began to rapidly shrink in front of him. Not long after, it had already shrunk to the size of a basketball and slowly floated in front of him. I was the one who activated you. Do you still want to resist me? Luo Fan said calmly. With a gentle lift of his hand, he had already grabbed the incomparably tough brain. Electric currents were triggered from the brain and brazenly bombarded Luo Fan like bolts of lightning. Luo Fan did not even bother to pay attention to this kind of powerless resistance. He let the lightning flow through his body, but he did not suffer any damage. He still calmly grabbed the brain. This brain was the brain of the chaos snake. It was born from the interaction between the chaotic state and the earth in this timeline. Such a brain already contained endless power and incredible power. Without Luo Fan, even if it was bombarded into countless pieces, it would still be able to turn each piece into a living creature and continue its original mission, which was to destroy the Earth and the universe. However, at this time, after being communicated and activated by Luo Fan's power, it had fallen from the original chaotic creation to a human creation. It had completely lost that characteristic. Besides, because it was activated by Luo Fan, every part of the brain contained his brand, which was equivalent to a magic treasure that had been completely refined by him. Under such circumstances, it could still resist Luo Fan. This was enough to show how extraordinary the brain was and how powerful the Chaos Snake was. However, a brand was a brand. Even if the Chaos Snake's brain could instinctively resist to a certain extent, it could not completely resist Ouyangming's means. Therefore, under Luo Fan's power, the resistance of this brain continued to weaken. The countless bolts of lightning that constantly flowed out of its body also decreased. In the end, after dozens of breaths, the brain had completely turned into a brain-shaped crystal that flickered softly in Luo Fan's hand. It looked like it had completely turned into a pet that had been completely subdued. Chapter 1965. At this moment, the brain seemed to have turned into an external organ of Luo Fan's. He already knew everything that was going on in it. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to obtain all the memories in the brain, all he needed to do was to keep digging into the depths of the brain. With a slight thought, he shifted his gaze to the outside world. In an instant, the situation of the entire Earth appeared in his eyes without any reservation, and he had complete control over it in an instant. It had been more than 10,000 years since he had left the outside world and come here to cultivate. During this period of time, Luo Fan had left the environment of the outside world and obtained peace. However, the entire Earth in the outside world was in an abyss of suffering. Almost every galaxy, almost every planet and continent with living beings was in the midst of an incomparably tragic battle. There were simply too many living beings that came out of the primal chaos snake. Even though Space Maiden and Han Ku from an alternate timeline had dealt with the strongest of them, the remaining countless living beings were still too powerful for the cultivators of the Earth in the Earth's universe. Under such a contrast of power, the cultivators of the Earth in the Earth's universe had to sacrifice dozens or even hundreds of cultivators who were second only to the primal chaos snake in order to destroy a living being that came out of the primal chaos snake. If Space Maiden from an alternate timeline had not put in a lot of effort to nurture the Earth in the Earth's universe, causing the number of cultivators in the Earth's universe to increase by many times, perhaps the consumption would have been enough to turn the entire Earth into a wasteland in just a few years. However, even with the foundation laid by Space Maiden from an alternate timeline, a loss was still a loss. The price was the price, and the entire Earth's universe seemed extremely tragic under this situation. Now, 10,000 years later, although the Earth's universe had already wiped out the many living beings that came out of the primal chaos snake, nearly 80% of the entire universe had been destroyed. Now, at a glance, there were ruins everywhere. There were ruins of battlefields everywhere, and the corpses of all kinds of living beings that many cultivators had flocked to were floating in the universe like garbage. No cultivators came to deal with them at all. Such a scene was enough to show how tragic the previous battle was. At this moment, Space Maiden and Han Ku, who were in an alternate timeline, were hovering above a continent near the center of the Earth universe. They were looking at the entire universe in confusion. Below them, many cultivators were also looking at the two of them with similar gazes. After the great calamity of the past 10,000 years, there are many things to be done in the universe. I intend to reshape the universe, and I hope that fellow Taoist will assist me, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline said. Hearing this, the cultivators below her all bowed with excitement and said, "Teacher, please act. We will definitely do our best." For these practitioners, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline was a guide. They were only able to achieve what they had today because of the Empyrean from a different timeline. Therefore, for the many cultivators, the empty maiden from a different timeline was a void maiden. He was their teacher. If it weren't for the fact that the void maiden in the alternate timeline had clearly stated that they weren't her disciples, they would have addressed her as their teacher. The Empyrean from a different timeline was here in her true body. The previous part was wrong, corrected here. There was no need to mention how strong he was. At this moment, with a jolt of power, endless runes erupted from her body and spread across the entire universe. The symbols on her body were mysterious and profound, containing inconceivable principles and unimaginable might, directly surpassing time. In just a few breaths of time, it covered every inch of space in the entire Earth's universe. Even Luo Fan's current location, where the solar system was located. It was also covered by the endless runes. After these runes covered such a huge space, they began to condense the bodies of the countless living beings scattered in the endless space. Like a huge mill, they began to grind these corpses into pieces, releasing the power that formed these corpses and integrating them into the Earth's cosmos. They began to restore the various broken parts of the Earth's cosmos, causing the entire Earth's cosmos to restore its order at an incomparably fast speed. Fellow Taoists, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? The Empyrean from a different timeline shouted. Along with this shout, countless runes erupted from their bodies and began to converge with the endless runes emitted by Space Maiden from an alternate timeline. They began to work hard to fill the gaps of the runes, causing the runes in the entire Earth's universe to become denser and denser. The crushing power of the runes on the countless corpses became stronger, and the speed at which the corpses disintegrated became faster. At this moment, it could be seen that there was a huge gap between these cultivators and the Empyrean from a different timeline. It should be known that the Empyrean from a different timeline was only one person. However, the runes emitted from her body were more than 10 times more than the runes emitted by all the other cultivators combined. Such a large number of runes supported the vast rune layer that covered the entire Earth's cosmos, guiding the entire rune layer to transform into all sorts of indescribable, mysterious changes, controlling and repairing the entire Earth's cosmos. Although Hun-Ku also wanted to help, she did not cultivate the path of runes. If she were to help, she might be able to speed up the restoration of the Earth's cosmos. However, in this way, the laws of the entire Earth's cosmos would inevitably become chaotic, causing the path of runes to become impure. This, compared to being a little slower, was actually a bigger problem. Therefore, even though she was many times more powerful than the other cultivators, she could only watch from the side and act as a protector for the Empyrean from a different timeline. Where was Luo Fan? The Empyrean from a different timeline already knew from the beginning. At this moment, although her runes had already covered the original location of the Earth's cosmos, they did not really take effect. They did not modify this place. It was obvious that the location had been changed. They left it to Luo Fan. Luo Fan just smiled at this moment. He did not make any further changes to this area. Instead, he allowed this place to remain as it was. With a light step, he traversed through time and space and arrived at the center of the Earth's universe. He arrived at the place where Sky Maiden and the others were in a different timeline at this moment. For him, this timeline was not his timeline. Even if they had a similar environment, this fact could not be changed. Under such circumstances, there was no point in recreating the solar system here. Therefore, even though recreating the solar system and Earth was an extremely simple task for him and could be done with just a thought, he didn't do it. After arriving here, Hun-Ku said joyfully, "Daddy, we've done it." Luo Fan heard this and smiled. He said, "Not bad. It only took you 10,000 years to complete the entire process. It's indeed a great achievement." Hearing his praise, Hun-Ku's face lit up with joy. Although Luo Fan had appeared out of thin air, his existence was too high compared to the other cultivators in the Earth's cosmos. Therefore, no cultivators could discover his existence at this moment. To them, Luo Fan seemed to have always been here, but it also seemed like he had not been here at all. Even now, it was still the same. Repairing was more than 10 times more difficult than destroying. Therefore, even though there was a powerful existence like the Empyrean from a different timeline who was rebuilding this universe, restoring the entire universe was not something that could be done in a short period of time. Another 3 years passed. The entire Earth's cosmos had barely recovered a little due to the runes. Although there were still ruins everywhere, at least the order in most areas had been restored. However, at the very least, order had been restored in most areas, and they could support the survival of living beings and give birth to all kinds of living beings. Continuously releasing runes for 3 years was nothing for the Empyrean from a different timeline. It was not enough to make her feel tired. However, for the other cultivators in the Earth's cosmos, this was their limit. More and more cultivators could not take it anymore. They could only withdraw their power and let the countless runes return to their bodies. They struggled to break away from the process of repairing the Earth's cosmos. When they recovered, they found that the Empyrean from a different timeline was still the same as before. She did not seem tired at all. They could not help but admire her. Once again, they confirmed that the gap between them and their teacher was not something they could imagine. As for Luo Fan, who had appeared next to their teacher, they still turned a blind eye to him. They did not pay any attention to him at all. If this goes on, it'll take at least a few hundred years to complete. Luo Fan judged as he looked at the changes in the past 3 years. He let out a sigh, but he still couldn't bear to watch. Although it was only a few hundred years, which was nothing to him, he was impatient to see such an inefficient repair. He said, "Let me help too." Upon hearing this, Hun-Ku hurriedly said, "Daddy, you can't. You'll mess up Mommy's plan. Mommy just wants to transform the Earth's cosmos into a cosmos that matches the path of runes, so that there's a possibility of bypassing the tides of time. If you take action, I'm afraid this universe will become one that suits your cultivation path. In that case, Mom's plan will fail." Upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "I'm not using such an inefficient method to help this cosmos recover." As he said that, the power of laws surged and broke out of his body. It began to tremble and jump continuously, surpassing the limits of his body and rising to an extremely high level. In the end, the power of laws kept breaking through levels under his control and headed towards an extremely high level. Back then, he even had to pay a huge price to get close to this level. As he moved in the sky above this continent, there was also a large number of people. In the sky above the center of the Earth's cosmos, thunderous booms could be heard. The thunderous booms were so loud and vast. It was also so vast, containing inconceivable principles and unimaginable power. Amidst the booms, all living beings vaguely felt an indescribable emotion affecting their moods and emotions out of thin air. This kind of influence caused an indescribable doubt to arise in their hearts. This doubt emerged from the bottom of their hearts without any rhyme or reason. However, they did not feel anything unusual. Instead, it was as if this doubt was the real doubt in their hearts. This situation was enough to show that the thunderous booms coming from above were none other than the voice of the will of heaven and earth. The appearance of this voice represented one thing: the will of the heavens, and earth was feeling puzzled and unable to understand what was happening. Faced with such a situation, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline finally reacted. She inexplicably raised her head and looked at the sky. Then, she inexplicably looked at Luo Fan beside her. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled. "Don't worry, I won't mess up your plan." As he spoke, waves of power of laws burst out of his body without hesitation. They kept rushing out of his body and climbing upward, crossing layers after layers and getting closer to the layer where the will of heaven and earth was. He transmitted waves of his will into the will of heaven and earth, making it difficult for the will of heaven and earth to understand his will. As the thunderous booms kept coming from above, there was still only doubt in this sound. However, there was no resentment or joy. There was no reward for the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline either. This was enough to show how different the will of heaven and earth was from the way of thinking of ordinary living beings. For ordinary living beings, helping them survive and defend against external enemies was a great kindness. All living beings should engrave this in their hearts, and when possible, they would definitely reward and express their gratitude. However, this was not the case for the will of heaven and earth. The will of heaven and earth did not have the same thoughts of survival as ordinary living beings. To it, the destruction of living beings might be nothing more than a nap or a short nap. Under such circumstances, it would not show much gratitude to the existence that stopped it from napping or narrowing its eyes. It was just like what was happening right now. The actions of the Void Lady in the alternate timeline, in her own eyes, and in the eyes of the many living beings and cultivators in this world, were helping this world to fend off its enemies, helping this world to survive the great calamity. However, to the will of heaven and earth, this was nothing at all. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no joy, and there was no reward. However, it was clear that to Luo Fan, he did not awaken the will of heaven and earth to reward the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline. Instead, it was for something else at this moment. He used the power of laws to continuously transmit his thoughts and will through all kinds of indescribable and mysterious channels. He sent them to where the will of heaven and earth was located so that the will of heaven and earth could understand them. Following his will, the will of heaven and earth began to move slowly. A huge whirlpool appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the Earth's universe. This huge whirlpool was so huge that it almost filled the entire world and enveloped the sun and the moon. It looked like an incomparably huge. I was overlooking everything in the universe from high up in the sky. Soon after, A strange fluctuation was emitted from every inch of the void in the entire Earth's universe. This strange fluctuation was so wonderful that after it appeared, it began to strengthen rapidly and gradually materialize. This materialization gradually combined with the endless runes in the entire Earth's universe, forming an indescribable change. Due to this change, their combination gradually turned into a kind of light. It was a bright red light. In that instant, Space Maiden, who was in an alternate timeline, sensed that the endless runes that she emitted had suddenly broken free from her control, as if they had become independent, or as if they were being controlled by some supreme and undefeatable existence. The bright red light continued to strengthen and condense with the increase of the strange fluctuations. Gradually, it turned into an endless sea of light that dyed the entire Earth's universe bright red. It looked as if the endless bright red light had condensed into a universe. Bright red light began to surge. Every time it surged, an indescribable change occurred in the space-time of the Earth's universe. Every change was fed back to the nomological laws and the Great Path, causing them to undergo corresponding changes. This is the tide of the times. The air hostess, who was in a different timeline, finally realized what had happened. Her face was full of disbelief, and she looked at Luo Fan as if she was looking at a supreme, true divine. Chapter 1966. The Air Lady in the alternate timeline looked a little startled. After a while, she sighed and said, "How great would it be if all of this could last for a long time?" Obviously, the wonderful changes that occurred in the Earth's universe in this timeline made her realize that the timeline in front of her could not last for a long time. She did not know when the 7 true sages would completely change the development process of the entire Earth's universe, causing the future of the reincarnation cycle to disappear completely. Subsequently, the Earth's universe in this timeline would disappear completely. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "No matter how long it takes, you've still reversed the fate of the destruction of this timeline. This is already an extremely impressive achievement. Beings at our level can't think about more extravagant requests." Upon hearing this, the Air Lady in the alternate timeline looked even more bitter. However, she did not say anything more in the end. Under the will of heaven and earth that had been awakened by Luo Fan, the era trend of the Earth's universe's early arrival was constantly cleansing the entire Earth's universe, causing every inch of space-time and every wisp of rule in the entire Earth's universe to constantly change and transform into a form that the Air Lady in the alternate timeline was extremely familiar with. It was a form that almost completely matched her own rune Tao. This bright red light surpassed time. Under this bright red light, in the entire universe of Earth, except for a certain area around Luo Fan and Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, the time of all living beings in other locations had been completely stagnated. This earth-shattering change did not exist in the eyes of all living beings. All living beings were isolated from the bright red light at this time, and they were directly stagnated on the spot. After an unknown period of time, perhaps it was just a moment, or perhaps tens of millions of years, the bright red light gradually separated into waves and runes again. This caused all the bright red light to gradually dissipate and eventually turn into nothingness. As the bright red light disappeared, the countless runes that scattered from it suddenly collapsed completely, as if they had never appeared. All of a sudden, it completely collapsed, as if it had never appeared in the first place, completely disappearing without a trace. That inexplicable fluctuation also gradually converged and turned invisible. In the end, in the center of the Earth's universe, the huge eye-like vortex above Luo Fan and the others began to gradually dissipate. Not long after, it completely disappeared without a trace. Only at this moment did the stagnant time disappear. Just like before, the entire Earth's universe began to operate again. The times have indeed changed. Now I can feel that the next wave of the era will arrive in 5-6 billion years. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, had a joyful expression on her face. Even though he knew that this would be the case, he still couldn't be at ease until he confirmed it. Luo Fan saw it. Nodding his head, he said, "Indeed, the world's origin energy born in the universe now already contains a great amount of runic characteristics. If we use it to cultivate the way of runes, it'll be twice the result with half the effort." The air hostess in the alternate timeline looked on with a faint smile on her face. At this moment, Han Ku's face was full of joy. To her, no matter what, as long as her mother was happy, she would naturally be happy too. "Thank you for your benevolence, teacher." At this moment, the surrounding cultivators all knelt down in unison towards the space maiden from an alternate timeline. They shouted loudly. To the many cultivators who had maintained the flow of time, due to the influence of the space maiden from an alternate timeline, they had witnessed the changes of the entire Earth's universe. Everything that had happened just now had been deeply engraved in their hearts like faith. It was something that they would never be able to forget for the rest of their lives. They felt that the power and terror of the space maiden from an alternate timeline had advanced to a higher level. The space maiden from an alternate timeline smiled faintly and said, "The era has just changed, and there are many things waiting to be done. Go and help the universe recover." "As you wish," many cultivators said extremely respectfully at this moment and turned into long rainbows. They flew in all directions of the entire Earth's universe, dispersing into the vast and boundless universe that was unknown how many billions of light years there were. Seeing that they had left, the space maiden from an alternate timeline turned around and said to Luo Fan, "I plan to stay here for a while longer." Hearing this, Luo Fan only shook his head and said, "Is that necessary? Now that the cultivation foundation of the Earth's universe has been established, even if you stay here, you'll only be enjoying the worship of all beings. How will that help the Earth's universe?" The space maiden from an alternate timeline looked a little dazed. After a long while, she said, "I plan to build a passage and guide some cultivators to that world." Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. "You really think that?" At this moment, the space maiden from an alternate timeline sighed and said, "Of course. Why would I say that if I didn't think that way?" "You can't, Mom." At this moment, before Luo Fan could say anything, Han Ku spoke up. "Just now, the three of us came here on our own. We've already spent a lot of energy and almost lost half our lives. This time, we're going to build a passage for many beings to pass through. How much energy would that cost? It's not something we can bear at all. It's not us, it's me." The space maiden from an alternate timeline's expression had become resolute. Clearly, the words she had spoken just now had truly steeled her heart and allowed her to truly make a decision. "You plan to sacrifice your cultivation?" Luo Fan frowned. Given the space maiden's current level, there was only one possibility for her to do that. That was, she had to give up her original cultivation and use everything she had. With the help of the treasure that she had obtained by chance, which was almost superior to a primordial era spiritual treasure, there was a chance that she could build this passage. He did not believe that the space maiden from an alternate timeline did not know this. The space maiden from an alternate timeline nodded and said, "These days I've actually gained a new understanding of my own cultivation path. Now, the path of runes doesn't really suit me. Therefore, I've already planned to recultivate. Giving up my cultivation now is just making use of waste." As she spoke, she looked a little mischievous. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally knew that although it was not a lie, it was just a deliberate explanation. It should be known that, even if she had gained a new understanding of her own cultivation path, it was just a little. It was not to the point where she had to give up everything and recultivate. Moreover, even if she gave up her cultivation and recultivated, with some preparation, the abandoned cultivation could also be converted into new cultivation and become the foundation for recultivation. It was not as useless as what she said. It could be said that the space maiden from an alternate timeline had sacrificed a lot to make this decision. It was still a pity, however, it was her own choice. Therefore, Luo Fan only sighed and said, "Is it really worth it? Although this timeline is indeed your timeline, the living beings here are already completely unfamiliar to you, including your friends and family. How many of your friends and relatives can stay until now? Is it really worth it to give up billions of years of cultivation for these living creatures that are almost completely unfamiliar to you? Whether it's worth it or not, it's just a feeling in my heart. Now that I think it's worth it, it's worth it. The Space Maiden from an alternate timeline let out a long sigh. Her eyes flashed with a hint of understanding. With this understanding, Luo Fan faintly felt that her aura began to rise slightly. It seemed that because of this, she had understood something that she had never understood before, something that allowed her to see through some kind of obstacle. Because of this, her cultivation realm had received some kind of indescribable improvement. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that no matter what he said, it was useless. For the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline, this choice could be said to have become a part of her cultivation. In other words, now, she could only give up her own cultivation in order to recultivate more thoroughly. Only then could she walk faster and smoother on the new path. Of course, this was not a requirement of her own cultivation path. Instead, at this moment, she had comprehended all sorts of things by relying on this choice. Naturally, it had already slightly changed the cultivation path that she had chosen. At the very least, it had affected the method to recultivate. She had been affected by it. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an indifferent look on his face. His mind had already turned into a tranquil state. Although Hun Ku's eyesight was powerful, she was still unable to see through the crux of the matter in an instant like Luo Fan. At this time, she was still incomparably anxious. She kept persuading the air hostess in a different timeline, trying to make her change her mind and not make such a choice, however. Her persuasion seemed so powerless against the calm and gentle words of the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline. In the end, she could only look towards Luo Fan for help. Luo Fan sighed. There's no need to say more. This is already a part of her cultivation path. Stopping her now is the same as stopping her from seeking the path. Hearing this, Hun Ku was dumbfounded. In the end, she nodded with a bitter expression and finally shut her mouth. Only then did Luo Fan turn to the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline. Although you have to sacrifice yourself, you have to think about how to sacrifice yourself. Next, you should think more about it to avoid any wastage. We will stand guard for you here. Hearing this, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline said gratefully, I will be careful. Next, I will have to trouble you. Hearing this, Luo Fan only sighed. At this moment, an inexplicable expression appeared on Hun Ku's face. It was rather helpless and complicated. At this moment, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline smiled. Her figure flashed, and she had already stepped into the depths of the rules, arriving at the origin of the rules of the Earth universe. The existence of the origin of the rules was idealistic. Whether it existed or not depended entirely on the concept of the observer. It was apparent that the origin of the rule existed in the Empyrean's perspective of an alternate timeline. Since that was the case, it would naturally appear in this place. As for why she came to the origin of the rules, the reason was very simple. In order to set up the channel, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline needed to have a deep understanding of the entire Earth universe. Moreover, the deeper she went, the better the understanding would be. Only with a deep enough understanding would she be able to use the least amount of energy to construct this kind of tunnel. Seeing that she had entered the origin of the rules, Luo Fan sighed and said to Hun Ku, Don't worry. If everything goes well, she should be able to improve further after this recultivation. I hope so. Hun Ku's expression looked a little better. However, her worry still hadn't completely disappeared. This was to be expected. If this worry could disappear just by saying that, then it would be too worthless. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. He didn't try to persuade her. He just sat cross-legged, and his figure gradually disappeared into the void. He disappeared from Hun Ku's perception. He also disappeared from the perception of all cultivators and creatures in this universe. Hun Ku wasn't surprised to see this. Letting out a sigh, her figure also disappeared, stepping into the world that she had casually opened up. This whole process happened completely under the eyes of Luo Fan. He clearly saw the whole process and felt all the details. Luo Fan hid in the void, but he didn't just stand there in a daze. Instead, he began to grab the Chaos Snake's brain that he had refined. This Chaos Snake's brain was Luo Fan's biggest goal when he came to the Earth universe in this timeline. However, ever since he obtained this brain, he hadn't had the time to carefully study the memories within it. It wasn't until now that he found an opportunity. With a slight thought, Luo Fan held the Chaos Snake's brain in his hand. The incomparably firm and pliable feeling made people feel that it wasn't a brain at all. Instead, it felt like it was the most mysterious material in the universe. At this moment, the brain began to tremble slightly. Strands of memories began to appear in front of his eyes under his will. This display didn't start from the beginning, but from the end. In other words, after the Chaos Snake's death. The numerous memories that had been grasped by him started to be pushed forward continuously. Finally, it was pushed forward to the time before he stepped into this Earth universe and the various scenes in the state of chaos. Even, it was pushed forward to the scene at the beginning of its birth. Countless lights, shadows, and voices appeared in front of Luo Fan and echoed in his ears. In a trance, he felt like he had transformed into this Chaos Snake. From the end, he started to experience everything that the Chaos Snake had encountered. As for the memories after stepping into this Earth universe, it was extremely easy for Luo Fan to trace them back. In a short time, he had already traced back to the moment when he had just stepped into this Earth universe. Within it, he saw himself, the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline, Hunku, and the planets destroyed by the Chaos Serpent countless times over, the destroyed galaxy, and the many cultivators who perished. And it was also because of these memories that Luo Fan truly felt the power of the Chaos Serpent itself. He also felt to what extent the Earth had grown under the nurturing of the Space Lady from the alternate timeline. It could be said that the Earth universe before it was destroyed by the Chaos Snake was not much different from the Earth universe before it was broken, except that the stability of time and space couldn't be changed. This was at least 100 times stronger than what Luo Fan saw when he stepped into this timeline. I didn't expect that before I came here. There had been such an impassioned war. Luo Fan thought as he looked at all the memories in front of him quietly. Just when he thought that he could easily trace back and find out what the Chaos Creature looked like in the eyes of the Chaos Creature and what incredible mysteries it had, an accident happened. The Chaos Long Snake's memories could only be traced back to the moment it stepped into this world. However, no matter how hard it tried, it could not move forward. It couldn't let him see what the Chaos Creature looked like in the eyes of the Chaos Snake. It was as if the primal Chaos Long Snake had only been born the moment it stepped into the world, and it had no memory of it at all before that. How is this possible? Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan couldn't believe it. Although this phenomenon could be explained by saying that the primal Chaos Serpent was only born after stepping into this world, Luo Fan knew that it was impossible. That was because in the primal Chaos Long Snake's memories, the memories before this took up the most weight. Compared to the memories before this, the many memories after stepping into the Earth's universe were just a drop in the bucket. They were insignificant. Why can't I trace back? I've clearly refined the entire brain, and all the memories in the brain should be at my disposal. His brows were deeply furrowed at this moment. He tried his best to trace back and control his perception to enter the depths of the Chaos Snake's memories, trying to find whatever he wanted. In the end, his efforts paid off. He finally saw a small fragment in the depths of the memory. It was like a small fragment in a movie that had tens of thousands of hours. Chapter 1967. That ray of light was a bright red light. Within it were countless magical symbols, as well as endless mysteries. It was unknown where the ray of light came from. In a flash, it had already passed through the primal Chaos Long Snake. The entire process happened in a flash, as if it had not experienced any time at all. However, even though it was so short, it seemed as if it had not experienced any time at all. It was as if no time had passed at all. Not even a split second, not even a billionth of a second had passed. Yet, the changes it had caused were as if the heavens and earth were being split apart. Before this, The primal chaos long snake's physical condition was something that Luo Fan could not understand. He could not even dig out the slightest bit of its state in his memory. The situation after that was similar. Although it was not the state of the body that caused this result, the result was the same. He could not understand the state of the body or the state of the body. It was only in this millionth of a second that he was able to discover that the primal chaos long snake was collapsing from a state that Luo Fan could not describe and turning into a long snake covered in countless runes. Under normal circumstances, even if Luo Fan were to perform this change in millionth of a second, it would probably take him several years to complete it. However, at that time, under the illumination of that bright red light, the change was completed in less than a millionth of a second. Such a result made Luo Fan secretly shocked, but at the same time, his heart gave birth to all kinds of indescribable enlightenment. Bright red light. It couldn't be anywhere else. It must be in this timeline. The era tide of the Earth universe. According to logic, it was very obvious. It was precisely because the changes in the Earth universe had triggered the change of the era tide that some creatures in the state of primal chaos were affected and were summoned to the Earth universe. It replaced the era tide to destroy the entire Earth universe. Then, the Earth universe would be completely destroyed, causing the Earth universe to step into another era. Deducing with this kind of logic, it obviously made sense. As he thought of this, he began to recall the memory. He slowed down the entire process of the light streaking across the body of the chaos snake. He treated a moment as billions of years, and the process of the light streaking across the body of the chaos snake was divided into billions of years. Following this change, the various changes that occurred in the instant the light flashed was finally revealed to Luo Fan's senses. Even if he had slowed down time to such an extent, the speed at which the bright red light flashed was still extremely fast, but it only appeared for a few breaths before it disappeared without a trace. Such a short period of time. This was enough to tell how short the time it took for the bright red light to appear was. It was also enough to tell how intense and fast the transformation of the primal chaos long snake was. With a thought, Luo Fan wanted to slow down time again. He wanted to watch the entire process of the bright red light flashing even more slowly. But, in the end, he found that he could still slow down the memory. Bright red light flashed at a speed that seemed to have reached its limit. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't slow it down at all. When he realized this, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. Before he transmigrated, he had learned from Earth that the speed of light was absolutely fixed in the Earth's universe. No matter what speed was used, no matter which direction one moved in, the measured speed of light would definitely be a fixed value. However, this was only the understanding of the secular world. After he stepped onto the path of cultivation, as his cultivation realm continued to increase, he found that this view was not completely wrong, but it could only be true under very few and very strict conditions. Even ordinary cultivators who had yet to become immortals would definitely have ways to bypass this so-called truth through various means. Therefore, from then on, he had become very disdainful of the so-called fixed state of things and phenomena. No matter what he did, the other party would definitely be in a fixed state. With this mentality, when he came into contact with the bright red light that he had slowed down to its limit, no matter how much he slowed it down or how hard he tried, he couldn't slow it down at all. It went without saying that he was greatly stimulated. The tide of the times, the tide of the times. After the stimulation, Luo Fan realized that his understanding of the tide of the times and the tide of the times was actually very shallow. Back when he was on the path of transcendence, Luo Fan had relied on the reincarnations of the times and witnessed the effects of the tide of the times to understand some of the mysteries of the tide of times. He had even used his magic power to create some similar tide of the times to fight his enemies. However, after he passed the path of transcendence and stepped into the Earth's universe before the world had shattered, as his knowledge and techniques grew, he gradually became less interested in the power of the tide of the times. Gradually, he thought that it was nothing more than that and gradually threw it to the back of his mind. Until now, he had not thought about the existence of the tide of the times for many years. However, now that he had seen the other side of the tide of the times, he finally understood that his previous understanding was actually so wrong. The power of the tide of the times was far greater than what he had seen and thought back then. Just the method of transforming the primal chaos snake in front of him had already surpassed the power of all the tide of the times that he had understood, not to mention that this might only be the tip of the tide of the times. Perhaps the possibility that even a true sage can't withstand the tide of the era really exists. Subsequently, he thought to himself again. Back then, when his clone had just stepped into this Earth's universe, due to his understanding of the reincarnation of the times and his perception of the past eras, he had a speculation in his heart. Even the sages could not withstand the changes of the eras, and had died after the era of the sages, this kind of thinking. As his cultivation realm increased and his understanding of a true saint became deeper, he gradually regarded this as a kind of dark history. It was proof that he was a frog at the bottom of a well. After all, a true sage was so powerful and so incredible. Not to mention the broken Earth universe. Even if the Earth universe was in perfect condition, a true sage would be able to destroy it with a single slap. Under such circumstances, how could the tide of the times produced by the shattered Earth's universe be able to resist a true saint? But now, he suddenly realized that the profundities of this era were even more profound than he'd imagined. Even compared to the true saint that he knew, it seemed to be not the slightest bit weaker. Under such circumstances, the tide of the times might really be something that a true saint could not handle. That was to say, his previous guess that was like a frog at the bottom of a well. Perhaps there was a chance that it was correct. With all these thoughts in his mind, Luo Fan eventually put all these thoughts to the back of his mind. There was no other reason. After all, the previous experience was enough to impress him. The various experiences of being slapped in the face over and over again. It had already made him understand that even if he was ready to go through the fourth tribulation, compared to the existence of a true saint, he was still far behind. Trying to guess the existence of a true sage was like a blind man trying to feel an elephant. Even if he had absolute confidence, it would be like trying to guess an elephant. Even if he had absolute confidence, the final result would probably be far from the truth. In other words, even if he was confident in his guess now, when the final result came out, he would definitely be slapped in the face by the truth. Under such circumstances, unless he was a masochist, what interest would he have in guessing this? After putting these thoughts to the back of his mind, he began to carefully observe the changes in the body of the primal chaos long snake. Although the changes were only for dozens of breaths, with the huge body of the primal chaos long snake, the area that it changed in every moment was extremely vast. The vastness of this change allowed Luo Fan to have enough samples to study and compare. The final result was that he had the opportunity to study some things. It was impossible to understand the true appearance of the primal chaos long snake through this memory. It was as if there was an indescribable restriction shackling him, making it impossible for him to truly understand what the creature in the state of chaos looked like. However, Luo Fan could already feel the incredible truth and mystery contained within the scene that was revealed before the change. The scene, after a large part of it had been destroyed, had already allowed Luo Fan to feel the incredible truth and mystery contained within it. The indescribable lines, every detail that contained endless truth, and even every wriggle and change of the body of the primal chaos long snake during the transformation made Luo Fan extremely fascinated. The various corresponding reactions with the runes made him almost unable to help but focus all his attention on it. Although it was only dozens of breaths, Luo Fan felt that if he wanted to study all the changes thoroughly, he would need at least tens of millions of years to have a chance of doing so. Besides, this was only the changes of the primal chaos long snake's body. As for the bright red light and the mystery of the era tide itself, it would take even more time. Besides, the possibility of studying it thoroughly was tens of thousands of times less than studying the mystery of the primal chaos long snake's body changes. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan was not discouraged, nor did he have any thoughts of giving up. He just wholeheartedly devoted his attention to it, perceiving every little change in it. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly returned to his senses from a state of study. He suddenly sensed that there seemed to be a strange power in the outside world that was breaking through space and attacking him. This power was nothing to him, but if he ignored it, he was afraid that it would affect the study of Space Maiden in an alternate timeline. As a guardian, he naturally could not let this happen. At this moment, his figure instantly left the void and arrived in the real space-time. As soon as he appeared, he discovered what the thing that was attacking him was. It was a long snake that looked rather familiar to him. Why is there such a creature? Luo Fan looked at this scene and thought to himself. That long snake was none other than the snake. It was exactly the appearance of the primal chaos long snake. Its body was extremely huge, and it was covered with countless runes, apart from the fact that it did not have the strong chaotic aura of the primal chaos long snake, and its size was tens of thousands of times smaller. Everything else looked the same as the primal chaos long snake. If such a creature had nothing to do with the primal chaos long snake, he would not believe it even if he was beaten to death. Although it was tens of thousands of times smaller than the real primal chaos long snake, the size of the primal chaos long snake was still extremely shocking considering its body size was calculated in terms of light years. Arriving here, the center of the universe on Earth was almost completely covered by it. All of a sudden, a huge shadow shrouded the place where Luo Fan and the others were, and even the land seemed to be unable to contain this huge long snake. The long snake's eyes were filled with endless hatred, and its target was none other than Luo Fan. At this moment, Hun, who had already come out of the world she created and stood in front of Luo Fan. "Daddy, what is this?" Hunku asked with a look of horror on her face when she saw this. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan just faintly said, "I don't know yet, but I will know soon." After saying that, his figure flashed. As he spoke, his figure flashed, and he appeared in front of the long snake. He raised his hand and pressed down on the long snake. At this moment, the long snake's body trembled, and it opened its mouth to spit out a huge stream of air towards Luo Fan. This stream of air was extremely mysterious, and there was a hint of chaos within it. There were also countless runes that combined with each other to form a structure that could destroy heaven and earth. In the face of such a stream of air, a huge hand formed by the power of laws appeared in front of Luo Fan out of thin air and collided with the stream of air. The moment the huge hand came into contact with the stream of air, it suddenly closed and squeezed. With a loud crack, the huge stream of air collapsed under the pressure of the huge hand, turning into endless air currents that scattered in all directions. A void storm was stirred in the void, and the surrounding space-time began to produce endless cracks and fragments. At this moment, it could be seen that the long snake's control over its power was very weak. Although the universe on Earth was extremely fragile, an existence like Luo Fan would definitely be able to reduce the impact of his own power as much as possible. Even if he used his strongest attack, he would still be able to make the aftermath of the attack not damage the surrounding space-time. However, this long snake was obviously different. This kind of attack seemed to have exceeded its limits. Although it could be released, it couldn't be controlled. Not to mention that it had already collapsed. Even if it was originally intact, it probably couldn't suppress the damage to the surrounding space-time. During the impact, countless space-time storms were produced, and countless space-time fragments were formed. Compared to that chaotic long snake, you're much weaker. Luo Fan sighed at this moment. The huge hand formed by the power of laws swept, turned, and rushed forward. With a squeeze, the long snake was directly caught in its hand. Immediately afterward, the huge hand rapidly shrank. In just a short while, it had already shrunk from a size that could be calculated in light years to the size of a long snake that was as thick as an arm. With a pull, it was already in his hand. The whole process was so simple that it even made people suspect that it was a self-scripted, self-directed, and self-acted act. Let go of me. A hissing sound came from the long snake's mouth. Luo Fan was slightly taken aback when he heard this. He didn't expect this long snake to actually have enough spiritual intelligence. However, he wasn't interested in asking about this long snake. To him, the person he trusted more was himself. Therefore, his interest was piqued at this moment. Naturally, he wouldn't stand on ceremony with the long snake. He immediately extended his perception and brazenly poured it into the long snake's body. He began to thoroughly investigate every inch of the long snake's body. He thoroughly investigated every bit of the long snake's power structure. Then, he thoroughly investigated its brain and its soul. Every part of the long snake's body structure was almost identical to the chaotic long snake from back then, except for the fact that there was a soul in the depths of its brain. For example, Luo Fan thoroughly investigated the chaotic long snake from back then. Even though he had thoroughly examined its brain countless times, he still couldn't find the existence of a soul in the end. Moreover, its memories were completely in its brain, just like how a mortal knew about the human body. In such a situation, it was obvious that the chaotic long snake itself didn't have a soul. Perhaps it was because of this that the chaotic long snake's intelligence was so terrible that one couldn't bear to look at it. Although he didn't know how the long snake in front of him was related to the chaotic long snake, the reason why it truly possessed intelligence and could speak was probably because it had a soul. After understanding this, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. He lifted his hand and pulled the long snake's soul out of its body in an instant. Its soul was also in the shape of a long snake. It was suddenly pulled out from the depths of its sea of consciousness. For a moment, it couldn't react and looked around in a daze. When it saw Luo Fan's face, it suddenly realized what had happened. In an instant, its face was filled with horror as it shouted, "Let go of me! Let go of me!" He didn't know if it was an illusion, but Luo Fan felt that the soul's intelligence seemed to have improved after it was separated from its body. Even its logic seemed to have become much clearer. "Let me see what kind of identity you have." Immediately, he smiled and said. As he spoke, he didn't care about the long snake's soul and started to thoroughly investigate the long snake's memories. Chapter 1968. From the snake's memory, Luo Fan easily traced the snake's origin. The best novel reading experience is at. The long snake was formed by an invisible source of life aura from the disintegrated body of the primal chaos snake. When the primal chaos snake collapsed, it wasn't just its physical body that collapsed. Everything within the snake collapsed as well. Everything inside the snake collapsed completely. It was the same for the source of life. However, a living being formed from the true source of life wasn't shapeless and immaterial. So, just like all the other living beings formed from physical bodies, it was completely annihilated by the attacks of Void Maiden and the others from different timelines. In the end, only this living being formed from a strand of its aura remained. Because it was weak and shapeless, it was able to escape and ascend into the heavens, and it managed to escape the fate of countless living beings perishing. In the end, because everything about the primal chaos snake had died, only the living creature formed by a wisp of aura was left. Therefore, it inherited everything about the primal chaos snake. In the end, after a long period of time, it had finally grown to this extent. Under the urging of its instincts, it began to search for its main body, and then it found Luo Fan's location. Only then did the situation from before occur. After understanding all of this, an inexplicable smile suddenly appeared on Luo Fan's face. The appearance of the long snake might be a breakthrough point for him. The long snake had inherited everything about the primal chaos snake, including its fate, karma, and other more mysterious things. Under such circumstances, he might be able to install the primal chaos snake's brain on the long snake's body and make the brain lose its chaotic characteristics in the process. Although the possibility wasn't high, he might be able to analyze some of the primal chaos snake's memories that he couldn't understand. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't stand on ceremony. With a thought, he reached out his hand and plunged his palm into the snake's head. With a pull, the snake's brain fell into his hand. Then, without hesitation, he pressed the primal chaos snake's brain into the snake's head. After being activated by Luo Fan, the chaos snake brain was very mysterious. Apart from having a new master, it was no different from before. Under such circumstances, the instinct to survive and to be complete was naturally as strong as any other creature. Under such instincts, if he suddenly arrived at a place that was most suitable for him, how intense would the changes be? It went without saying. At this moment, countless blood vessels and nerves extended from the snake's brain and pierced into the snake's spine and flesh. All sorts of mysterious information flowed rapidly into the snake's body, gradually connecting the two. Asterisk, crack, asterisk, an earth-shattering thunderclap erupted from the long snake's body. Shortly after, the long snake exploded, and the surrounding space-time exploded as well. The surrounding laws. During this explosion, a powerful shock wave was released from the snake's body. The terrifying shock wave formed visible ripples that kept surging in all directions. All sorts of scenes covered the snake's body. Although all these changes were intense, it wasn't enough to move Luo Fan. Even if the space-time of the Earth universe was destroyed, when the impact of the laws passed through his body, it didn't leave a trace on him. It was as if it was just a breeze. Even his clothes didn't sway at all. At this moment, his eyes were burning. He saw through all obstructions and saw the changes that were happening to the snake's body. At this moment, the snake's body was only left with a skeleton. Moreover, it was just a skeleton. At this moment, it was constantly being damaged and crumbling. Gradually, it turned into a smoke-like existence formed by the flesh and blood around it. The smoke-like existence then flowed into the surroundings and surged in all directions. Luo Fan could tell at a glance that this was a sign that the snake's body couldn't withstand the power contained in the chaos snake's brain. In order for the chaos snake's brain to penetrate the snake's body, it obviously needed to pour power into the snake's body. This was obviously a huge test for the snake's body. After all, no matter how powerful the snake was, it was only formed from a strand of the primal chaos serpent's life source aura. Compared to the primal chaos serpent, its body was several tens of thousands of times weaker. Under such circumstances, how could the long snake withstand the power of the chaos serpent? In fact, Luo Fan had already expected this situation. At this moment, with a thought in his mind, his law power began to surge towards the remaining bones of the long snake. In an instant, it completely covered the remaining bones and began to slowly sink into them. It began to strengthen the long snake's bones, replacing the body of the long snake to bear the additional power of the chaotic long snake's brain. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if countless nuclear bombs had exploded in his hands. The force was not weak to him. In fact, it even made him feel a little pain, as expected of the power of the chaos snake. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Fortunately, the chaos snake's brain had been completely refined by him. No matter how strong the power within it was still within the range of his endurance. Therefore, even with such a pushing force, he could still easily endure the explosion of power. He even took a step further and started to strengthen the snake's bones, gradually improving the quality of the snake's bones. Although more and more of the snake's bones were broken, it was becoming smaller and smaller. However, its quality was becoming higher and higher. In the end, when the snake's bones were only left with a thumb-sized piece between its eyebrows, its body finally began to emit an indescribable gray light. This light was so profound and mysterious that it seemed to contain all the mysteries of the entire Earth's universe. It also seemed to contain the infinite principles of the chaos snake. In that light, even the laws of the Earth's universe seemed to have been distorted. In the void of the universe, a tribulation cloud suddenly appeared out of thin air. Lightning bolts burst out of the tribulation cloud. Then it slashed down valiantly towards the small fragment that was attached to the head of the chaos snake at this moment. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan just smiled and threw the brain in his hand forward. In an instant, the brain brazenly entered the tribulation cloud. As a result, the countless bolts of lightning exploded inward instead of outwardly. Boundless, terrifying power exploded without restraint. Boundless destructive shock waves swept in all directions, causing more and more space-time to collapse in the process. In the center of the Earth's universe, a dark hole gradually appeared. It was like an incomparably deep abyss. Apart from the tribulation cloud, there was nothing else. This process lasted for a long time. At a certain moment, an unparalleled power erupted from the tribulation cloud. It instantly tore the tribulation cloud apart, causing all the power contained within to erupt in all directions. At that moment, the scene within the tribulation clouds was truly revealed. It was the chaos snake's brain. It was still there, but the small bone between its eyebrows seemed even more resplendent. The gray light on it became even purer. It seemed to have become even more powerful after going through the tribulation cloud's baptism. At this moment, the bone suddenly produced an incomparably strong, attractive force. The terrifying power produced by the eruption of the tribulation cloud was suddenly affected by an unimaginable attractive force. In an instant, it changed its way of releasing power in all directions and began to converge inwards, directly pouring into the bone between the eyebrows of the chaos serpent's brain. As it poured in, the bone between its eyebrows was like a plant that began to sprout. It actually began to gradually wriggle and spread in all directions. When all the power was sucked out, the bone between its eyebrows had completely turned into a skull. It directly wrapped the chaos snake's brain within it. After the skull appeared, it seemed to have activated a switch. The long snake began to grow rapidly, and its spine began to extend under the skull. Ribs began to appear continuously. In just a few breaths, it had already grown into a huge skeleton that was as long as the original long snake. Along with this change, 2 spots of light suddenly appeared in the long snake's eyes. These 2 spots of light contained boundless chaos. They seemed muddle-headed, but they also seemed to contain endless instincts. They spun and looked at the world around them. An indescribable hatred was born in the light. However, when they turned to Luo Fan, the various kinds of light suddenly converged and turned into a kind of obedience. After that, the long snake's internal organs began to grow, and its flesh and blood began to grow. In just a few breaths, the long snake had completely recovered, and its appearance was no different from a normal one. After it returned to its complete form, it spun slightly and shrank abruptly. In just a short while, it had already shrunk to the thickness of an arm. With a tremble, it arrived in front of Luo Fan, circled slightly, and fell into his hand. Luo Fan looked at the long snake and felt the terrifying power within its body, which was many times weaker than the primal chaos long snake. However, compared to the previous long snake, it was many times stronger. Luo Fan was secretly looking forward to it. At this moment, Hun Ku, who was behind him, had already disappeared into the space-time that she had opened up. Although she couldn't understand what Luo Fan was doing, she knew that at least everything was under his control. Under such circumstances, she naturally didn't have to worry that this change would alarm her mother. Naturally, she wouldn't have to waste time and energy to care about it. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and a wave of law power began to cover the long snake. Immediately after, the law power began to give birth to countless changes. It slowly seeped into the long snake's body and analyzed all the secrets of the long snake bit by bit. For living beings without souls, their brains contained all of their memories. However, this didn't mean that only the brain had memories. In fact, every part of the body of any living being would have some memories more or less. These memories weren't as complete and organized as the memories in the brain, but they were more original and closer to the truth than the memories in the brain. This body, it wasn't the original body of the chaos long snake. Instead, it was a body formed by the aura of the chaos long snake's life source, which had been enhanced tempered, and assimilated countless times. In terms of itself, it didn't seem to contain the memories of the chaos-long snake itself. However, one mustn't forget that the nature of the chaos-long snake's power had reached an unimaginable level. If he wanted to bear this kind of power, naturally, it had to be extremely similar to the original body in order to be able to do so. Given the original body's quality, it had to be enhanced by tens of thousands of times in order to achieve this. The process of this enhancement was obviously a process of the chaos-long snake's own body improving again. Previously, only a piece of brow bone was left, and this entire body was born. This was the proof of this. Because of this, the long snake's body naturally assimilated a lot of memories that only the body of the chaos-long snake originally had. However, because it was only assimilation, therefore, this kind of memory was even more incomplete than the memories of the original body. However, for Luo Fan, this kind of incompleteness was exactly what he needed. Don't forget that he had the chaos-long snake's brain. If he really had the ability, why would he need to convert his body? Wouldn't he be able to directly read the memories in the brain? Not to mention the fact that there were countless bodies of the chaos-long serpent back then. Taking a step back and directly reading the memories of the chaos-long serpent was also an easy thing for him. There were so many ways. Why didn't he choose to do so? Why did he choose this huge detour? Wasn't this because, at his current level, he couldn't understand the memories of the chaos-long snake in its chaotic state? Therefore, he had no choice but to dilute these memories. Conversion, damaged methods, and continuous degeneration. Only now did he have the slightest possibility of reading the memories he wanted to understand. The memories of the chaos-long snake's body were more of an instinctive memory. In Luo Fan's mind, countless images and voices flowed through his mind. Countless images and voices flowed through his heart, making him feel as if he had turned into the snake's body and started experiencing everything that the snake had experienced. Just as he expected, the memories of the chaos-long snake formed by the aura were quite complete. When he looked at it, he compared it with the memories in the chaos-long snake's brain, which made the entire memory 100 times more vivid. The feeling that merged with those memories was also 100 times stronger. Across the body of the chaos-long snake, he continued to trace the memories forward. Those memories had already become extremely incomplete. It felt like a movie that was screened every few dozen frames. Naturally, it was quite strenuous to watch. However, when he combined these with the memories in the chaos-long snake's brain that he could read and understand, it also made those memories a lot more vivid. Soon, Luo Fan's tracing reached the moment when the chaos-long snake entered the Earth's universe. The further back he went, the more fragmented and the fewer the memories that he could see. However, the fragments that were occasionally revealed were great supplements to the brain's memory. This made Luo Fan look forward to the memories of the past. Soon, the tracing broke through a certain boundary and entered a place that could not be described with words. It works. For a moment, this was the only thought in Luo Fan's mind. Then, an indescribable joy emerged in his heart. The body's memory was the most intuitive and instinctive memory. This kind of memory was fundamentally different from the brain's memory. It did not use its own senses to understand everything in the outside world. Instead, it only recorded the bits and pieces that it came into contact with. Under such circumstances, the chaos-long snake's life experience in the state of chaos was a complete whole for its brain. It was a state of chaos that an existence like Luo Fan could not understand. His body, on the other hand, was no longer the same. In his senses, the chaotic state of his body had transformed into countless details, such as temperature, hardness, comfort, or pain. Wait. Under such circumstances, even if the complete body's memory was combined, it would still be in a state of chaos. It was still something that an existence like Luo Fan could not understand. However, when he extracted the fragments, images, and sounds, it was obvious that he had already broken through the chaotic state of the whole. Everything that was originally incomprehensible had finally turned into some comprehensible principles and mysteries. Of course, not all the fragments were separated to that extent. After all, there were still many fragments that could be combined into a state of chaos that Luo Fan could not understand. Therefore, Luo Fan could not understand all the memories of the Chaos Long Snake's body in the state of chaos. He could only understand a part of it that was fragmented enough. Chapter 1969. These scenes were intermittent. Some parts were clearly complete, but he just couldn't see through them and didn't know what they were exactly. For this, Luo Fan naturally knew in his heart that this was clearly a sufficiently complete memory with a chaotic state of the scene. He did not waste time entangling himself on this, but instead let go of these scenes and continued to move forward, tracing back to other scenes that he could understand. In the end, when he reached the point where he could no longer trace any further, what he obtained, what he could understand, were about 30 million fragments of the Long Snake's memories. Each of the 30 million memory fragments was about an instant. In this way, 30 million memory fragments were equivalent to 30 million instants, which was only about a day. The chaotic snake had clearly existed in the chaotic state for a very long time. At least, it had been a very long time based on its own time. Under normal circumstances, this period of time would take at least tens of thousands of years. However, in the end, by relying on this constantly degrading method, what Luo Fan obtained was only about a day's worth of the body's memories. This portion was so small that it was enough to make anyone despair. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had obtained these memories, didn't despair at all. Instead, there was only a faint sense of joy in his heart. With a wave of his hand, the boundless power of laws instantly shrouded the snake in his hand. It condensed slightly and turned into an imitation of the innate spiritual light. With a single change, the innate spiritual light completely sealed the snake. This sort of sealing transcended time, transcended space, and reached a fundamental level of the source of the world. Even the primal chaos long snake couldn't think under such a seal. Only an existence like Luo Fan could seal the chaotic snake so easily. If it had been anyone else, even Sky Maiden from an alternate timeline, they definitely wouldn't have been able to do this. Not to mention not being able to do this, even trying to slightly restrain the chaotic snake. That was something that was almost impossible. After sealing the chaotic snake, the spiritual treasure embryo in Luo Fan's hand shook slightly and produced a suction force that acted on the chaotic snake and pulled it into the mirror. Then it was pulled into the mirror. After that, Luo Fan's figure flickered and disappeared into the void again. He disappeared without a trace. At the center of the Earth's universe, there were no longer any sounds or signs of life. There was. However, under the effect of the great path of the Earth universe, the broken laws of the universe squirmed a little and slowly recovered. As a fragile world, the Earth universe had an advantage. It was extremely easy and fast to recover. In the short span of a few breaths after Luo Fan disappeared, the space-time in this area had completely recovered. He looked over. This place was completely normal, and he could no longer feel the heaven-shaking tribulation that had erupted here before. Hidden in the void, Luo Fan didn't care about the changes in the outside world at all. He had already immersed his mind into the 30 million fragments of the chaotic snake's body. Of these 30 million memories, 90% came from the primal chaos snake after the bright red light had changed its body. Only the remaining 10% came from the original primal chaos snake before the bright red light had changed its body. The remaining 10% came from the original chaotic snake's body before the bright red light transformed it. Obviously, the two parts of the memories were completely different. The memories after the bright red light transformed the body were easier to understand in Luo Fan's eyes. As for the memories before that, they were more unfathomable, untraceable, and more similar to the true meaning of the chaotic state. When Luo Fan was just as sage to be, he could already observe the chaotic state. He had comprehended the chaotic state. However, he was very clear about whether the state of chaos that he had observed and comprehended was the true state of chaos. It wasn't the true chaotic state at all. At least, it wasn't the original chaotic state that wasn't affected or changed by any part of the world. The chaotic state was just a state after the chaotic state degenerated under the influence of the world and lost its special characteristics. This state contained endless principles, mysteries, and unimaginable mysteries. It could even open up a perfect world and do everything that Luo Fan thought the chaotic state should be able to do. However, there was still an unreachable distance between it and the true chaotic state. At least, within the scope of Luo Fan's understanding, it was an unreachable distance. The reason for this was very simple. It was because this chaotic state was the chaotic state that came into contact with the perfect world. What kind of existence was the perfect world? It was a strange existence that could exist for a long time in the chaotic state and could resist the crushing and assimilation of the chaotic state. What was the gap between such an existence and the chaotic state? What was the barrier between the chaotic state and the chaotic state? Could it really be that layer of barrier that couldn't be separated, that couldn't be broken, that had a material form? If that was the case, why did the gap between the world and the chaotic state really exist in Luo Fan's understanding? Why did other living creatures think that the gap didn't exist and the gap really didn't exist? This kind of situation could naturally be explained by idealism, but no matter what, it wasn't enough to convince everyone. However, if it was explained in another way, then the degree of credibility would definitely be greatly increased. The explanation was that whether it was Luo Fan or other living creatures, their understanding of the gap between the world and the chaotic state was extremely rough. There was a huge difference between them and the true gap. In other words, the boundary between the chaotic state and the perfect world existed in a state that they couldn't understand. It wasn't a barrier or a gap. The reason why they thought that it was a barrier and that there was a gap was because of the limitations of their own ideas and cognition. With such cognition, Luo Fan naturally understood that outside the barrier, the existence that he thought was in the chaotic state obviously couldn't be the true chaotic state. It could only be an existence that had been distorted by various ideas, just like the barrier. It was because he clearly understood this. Therefore, this time, Luo Fan tried his best to see what the chaotic state looked like from the memory of the chaotic long snake. At least, he wanted to see what the chaotic state looked like in the eyes of chaotic creature like the chaotic long snake. And this time, the 30 million memory fragments that he had obtained were the best opportunity for him. At this moment, Luo Fan started to think. He began to analyze the seemingly meaningless fragments in detail and tried his best to integrate them. If he wanted to assemble a complete form from these fragments and form the true form of the primal chaos, this was obviously an extremely difficult process. Even for Luo Fan, who had experienced the chaotic state that was influenced by the perfect world for hundreds of millions of years, the difficulty would not be reduced at all. In those memory fragments, there were countless lights and shadows around him. There was also endless power, including everything that living creatures could think of and could not think of, all power and all matter. The richness was simply beyond his imagination. All of these fragments were combined in an extremely orderly way. Under the actions of the chaotic long snake, there were various corresponding changes. It was just like a world where one's wishes came true. The 30 million memory fragments were all similar. The only difference was that the scenes in each memory fragment were different. In the memory fragment, after the bright red light changed the chaotic long snake, the endless runes obviously occupied a large proportion. It seemed that in that crucial part, everything, all power, and even all other existences were strung together. In contrast, in the memory fragments before the bright red light changed, none of them were the main body, and none of them were secondary. It seemed that any kind of power, any kind of matter, and any kind of existence were all other existences. All matter and all power were the glue. They were the main body and strung together, everything else. This completely different scene represented an extremely complicated charm, which made Luo Fan have an inexplicable feeling in his heart. However, After all, these were only extremely short fragments. Even if Luo Fan saw these fragments clearly and knew that these fragments contained all kinds of inconceivable mysteries, in the end, he still couldn't completely understand all of this and couldn't analyze the meaning behind all of this. To him, the real meaning of all of this was that it told him that his guess was correct. The real chaotic state was really very different from the chaotic state outside of heaven and earth that he had always experienced. Perhaps the barrier between heaven and earth and chaotic state doesn't exist at all. There's a gradual evolution process between them. They're directly connected and not absolutely separated. All of a sudden, this thought flashed through his mind. As he thought of this, his worldview trembled a little. Immediately after, he sensed that the chaotic state that he had sensed suddenly had some kind of indescribable change. The gap between heaven and earth and chaotic state had completely disappeared at this moment, and the barrier on both sides of the gap had also completely disappeared at the same time. Sensing this, Luo Fan's eyes flickered, and he was about to take action. At this moment, in the center of the Earth's universe, Sky Lady, who was originally invisible and trying hard to think of the best way to sacrifice herself to build a passage from this Earth's universe to the other side of the universe, appeared out of thin air. Looking at her confident expression, Luo Fan knew that she must have gained a lot. With a slight thought, his figure appeared in front of Sky Lady in the alternate timeline. At the same time, Hun Ku also appeared in front of her. Compared to the confidence of Sky Lady in the alternate timeline, Hun Ku's expression seemed a little conflicted and contradictory. It was obvious that she was reluctant to let Sky Lady in the alternate timeline sacrifice herself. "I've thought through everything, and I can build a passage at any time," Sky Lady in the alternate timeline said to Luo Fan with a smile. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "It's good that you've thought it through. What's your method? Tell me about it. Perhaps there's still something that can be improved." At this moment, he had an inexplicable thought in his mind. Perhaps this was a good opportunity to see if his change of mind was correct. Hearing this, Sky Lady in the alternate timeline was slightly stunned. Then, she nodded in realization. She said, "It seems that you've also gained a lot. Well, my method isn't complicated. You'll understand it once you listen to it." Then, she waved her hand, and a light and shadow appeared in front of her. With an unimaginable speed, in just a few breaths, a light and shadow that should have been played for hundreds of years was played, although it was so fast. However, this was obviously not a problem for Luo Fan and Hun Ku. The two of them completely understood the information contained in it one after another. After Hun Ku understood it, she looked even more bitter, and the reluctance in her eyes became more obvious. As for Luo Fan, he closed his eyes after watching it. After thinking for such a long time, Sky Lady in the alternate timeline's method was obviously quite perfect. She had made full use of her power, the power of that strange power, and the power of the treasure that she seemed to have surpassed the chaotic origin spiritual treasure. It could be said that she had made full use of the greatest value of her sacrifice. Even with Luo Fan's wisdom, it was not easy for him to find something that could be perfected. Fortunately, she had not considered the biggest problem, which could even be said to be the most critical one. At least, in the current Luo Fan's opinion, she had not considered it. That key question was none other than the method by which the Earth and the universe were separated from that side of the world and the state of chaos. This passage, even if he borrowed so much power, he still had to break through this Earth's universe and break into another perfect world. Under such circumstances, this understanding was wrong. Naturally, it would be half the result with twice the effort, and it would be difficult to make full use of the highest level of efficiency. According to his own understanding, there was no real barrier between the perfect world and the chaos. The gap between the two was actually a gradual evolution layer. Soon, Luo Fan had found something that could be perfected. With a thought, he pointed at the video played by Sky Lady in the alternate timeline, at the place where the light and shadow was. In an instant, the faded light and shadow reappeared and replayed at the same speed. In the blink of an eye, there were all sorts of subtle changes in the key parts of the light and shadow. After the changes, at the end of the light and shadow, Sky Lady in the alternate timeline built the passage, but she still retained a bit of her origin. Although the sacrifice was extremely huge, it was many times better than the complete sacrifice back then, when her memories were consumed completely and she could only start from scratch again. Seeing this, Sky Lady in the alternate timeline was delighted at first, but soon felt puzzled. The changes Luo Fan made were very plain, and she didn't even add much. Instead, she made some cuts on top of her own plan, but in the end, she was able to achieve the result of preserving a little bit of her origin. Was this really possible? No matter how much she trusted Luo Fan, she was ultimately an independent practitioner. At this point, she could not help but feel doubtful. Is it really possible? Sky Lady in the alternate timeline asked. We'll have to try to know. If it doesn't work, we'll at most fail to build it, and we'll just have to start all over again, Luo Fan said with a smile. The sacrifice for the construction of the tunnel this time was not something that she had to pay at the start. Under the effect of that power and the help of the treasure in her hand, she could wait until the tunnel was truly built before paying the price. She could make up for everything that was needed to stabilize the tunnel and pour all of her cultivation into it. Therefore, if the passage couldn't be built, she would naturally have to pay the price. With that, she could experiment again and again. That's right, Dad is right. After all, there's no loss even if the passage can't be built. At most, we'll just work for nothing. So what if we try? Hun-Ku exclaimed joyfully. As she spoke, she looked at Sky Lady in the alternate timeline expectantly. To Hun-Ku, she did not have much affection for this universe. Even if all the living beings in this universe died, she would only sigh. Under such circumstances, she was naturally very unwilling to sacrifice Sky Lady in the alternate timeline. However, Sky Lady in the alternate timeline was very determined, and her father said that it would be good for her. This time, she had no choice but to reluctantly accept it. Now that she saw that there was a way to preserve the last bit of her origin and the last bit of her cultivation foundation without sacrificing so much, how could she not seize it? It was only natural for him to behave like this at this time. Listening to Luo Fan and Hun-Ku's words, Sky Lady in the alternate timeline thought that there was no harm in giving it a try. She nodded and said, "Then let's give it a try. However, if it really doesn't work, don't stop me." Chapter 1970. Space Maiden stood in the center of Earth's universe in an alternate timeline. Since this location was the center of the entire Earth universe, its position was naturally quite special in the entire Earth universe. The rules, laws, time, and space were the most unique in the entire Earth's universe. If one had to choose a location to set up the passageway, it was clear that this was the most suitable location. Therefore, at this time, she didn't need to leave this place to choose another place to experiment with the method that Luo Fan had just modified for her. Instead, there were countless runes gradually surging out of her body. These runes condensed into the shape of a rainbow and began to shuttle in the void, gradually forming an even larger rune. Then, this larger rune condensed into one and turned into a tiny rune. Immediately afterward, countless runes surged out of her body, and the process was repeated once again. Just like that, runes formed from countless runes continuously appeared around her and gradually began to circulate around her body. In just a few breaths' time, there were already hundreds of millions of such runes around her. Following that, the countless runes began to revolve and gradually converged. In the blink of an eye, they turned into an even grander, more profound, and more complicated third layer of runes. Following that, more and more of these runes were condensed layer by layer. It began to accumulate around her, and it continued to circulate. In the end, after gathering a sufficient amount, the third layer of runes began to combine, turning into a fourth layer rune. After the fourth layer was the fifth layer, then the sixth layer. A few years later, the rune's level increased. It had already reached 129,600 levels. Runes of such a level, the number of basic runes contained within had even surpassed the limits of what could be described with numbers. Condensing a rune of this level only took a few years for Empyrean, who lived in an alternate timeline. In reality, her own losses were negligible. In just a breath's time, she had completely recovered from this exhaustion. After all, this kind of ruin, it was something she could create at any time, and it had nothing to do with her origin. To her, it was like creating billions of times more. It was only a matter of time. After such a ruin appeared, it began to tremble slightly. A wave that shook the entire Earth's universe was transmitted from this 129,600 rune, causing the entire Earth's universe to buzz. At this moment, all the cultivators and living beings on Earth and in the universe were terrified. They could clearly feel the vibrations. An indescribable sense of fear welled up in the hearts of all living beings. At this moment, a faintly discernible vortex was forming in the sky above the center of Earth's universe. Seeing this vortex, Luo Fan knew that it was the manifestation of the Earth's universe's will. It seems that this approach has finally attracted the attention of the world's will. However, this is also a matter of course. Opening a passage from here to the other side of the perfect world is equivalent to opening a hole in this complete world. Even if it is in a deep sleep, the worlds will instinctively respond. Luo Fan looked at this scene and had such a thought in his heart. Just as he was about to face the world's will and argue with it, all of a sudden, after the huge vortex condensed into a shadow, it seemed to be unable to solidify further. It began to slowly dissipate, and not long after, it completely disappeared without a trace. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan already understood in his heart that the slumber of the will of the heavens and earth was too deep. Even if he opened a hole in its body, it was still unable to completely wake it up. This was clearly the best situation for Luo Fan and Empty Maiden in a different timeline. At this moment, Empty Maiden, who was originally worried about something in a different timeline, was finally completely relieved. She abruptly triggered the connection between herself and the strange power in the fragment of the world, and began to receive the power of that strange power, causing it to traverse time and space in the blink of an eye, descend, and suddenly connect with the 129,600 runes. Following this connection, the wave that the rune emitted that shook the entire Earth's universe suddenly converged. Not long after, it abruptly converged into the rune and began to shrink inwards, connecting with the power of the strange power. Gradually, it began to undergo an inexplicable adjustment. During this adjustment, the connection between the wave and the power became tighter, and in the end, they gradually resonated. Due to this resonance, Empty Maiden in a different timeline did not dare to be negligent. She narrowed her eyes, and endless runes once again erupted from her body, charging into the 129,600 runes brazenly. The 129,600 runes were already an extremely perfect rune that could not be separated at all. Originally, if more runes rushed into it, the most likely scenario would be that these runes would be smashed and nothing would be left. However, at this moment, those runes entered the 129,600 runes without any reservation, and as if they were absorbed by a black hole, they completely disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. As the runes disappeared, the resonance between the strange power and the rune became even stronger. Although the magnitude of this enhancement was relatively small, it was still a real enhancement. Faced with this situation, Empty Maiden in a different timeline was full of joy. This meant that the first obstacle of building this passage had been overcome. In other words, at least, before this step, all of Luo Fan's deductions were correct. What he needed to do next was to continuously strengthen this connection until it was truly and completely stable to the point where it was enough to build that space-time passage. And this would not be any worse than the 129,600 runes that were condensed previously at this moment. Empty Maiden in a different timeline sat cross-legged and closed her eyes. She held the 129,600 runes between her hands. Endless runes gushed out from between her hands and continuously entered that rune. Then, as if they were completely erased, they completely disappeared without a trace. At every moment, there were trillions of runes being sent into the 129,600 runes. This process lasted for 100 years. After 100 years, even Empty Maiden in a different timeline could not help but feel a tinge of fatigue. A trace of exhaustion flashed across her eyes. Trillions of runes were being created and sent out every moment. This was obviously not an easy task for her. And this went on for 100 years. Just how terrifying was the number of runes created? It was unimaginable. Although her body did not feel tired because of this, her mind would eventually be affected by it. Fortunately, after 100 years, it was now the final stage. On this day, when Empty Maiden in a different timeline sent the last rune into it, a strange sound came from the 129,600 runes. It instantly spread across the entire Earth's universe, causing all living beings in the Earth's universe to feel an inexplicable joy at the same time. It was like the joy of suddenly seeing an extremely faint light in absolute darkness. At this moment, Empty Maiden in a different timeline understood that the second step of building this passage had been completed. After sensing it slightly, she found that the power of the strange power had truly resonated with the 129,600 runes. The connection between the two had also been strengthened to a degree that could not be broken at all. It seems that the first two steps of deduction have been confirmed to be correct. Next, let's see if the third step, which is also the last step of deduction, is correct. The air hostess in the alternate timeline turned her head to look at Luo Fan and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, I'm looking forward to it. He was indeed looking forward to this result, because if the third step was successful, it would mean that the change in his perception of the evolution between heaven and earth and the state of chaos was correct. At least, at his level of understanding, it was correct. And this point was extremely important to him. This was because he had to use this change in perception to change his view of the world. And to him, the world was already his absolute foundation. If the change was correct, it would naturally allow his cultivation base to increase greatly. However, if the modification was wrong, or there was a huge oversight, then the consequences would be unbearable for him. Under such circumstances, how could he not look forward to the result? Be careful. Hunka finally could not help but say. Empty Maiden in a different timeline smiled and said, Don't worry. Didn't I say that even if it fails, there won't be too much danger? Hearing this, although Hunka's expression relaxed a little, she still did not completely relax. She was still a little nervous and worried. This was inevitable. After all, in her perception, Empty Maiden in a different timeline was her mother. Empty Maiden in a different timeline also knew that this could not be changed. After giving her some advice, she smiled faintly and ignored it. Then, her expression turned solemn. She raised her hand and took out an extremely ordinary-looking stone. Endless runes were emitted and poured into the stone. As it was poured in, the stone shone brightly and emitted an infinite amount of light. At this moment, the entire Earth's universe began to shake violently. The boundless laws in the surroundings began to twist and tremble as if a hand was grabbing onto a piece of cloth that was trembling nonstop. Then, the infinite amount of light changed direction and poured into the 129,600 layers of runes. In an indescribable change, it broke through the boundary. It disappeared without a trace. At the same time, the power of the strange power began to increase rapidly. From the originally formless power, it gradually transformed into a powerful substance. It gradually turned illusory into reality and began to transform the 129,600 layers of runes. The runes began to solidify, and the boundaries between each rune began to blur. In the end, it turned into a fist-sized black hole. Success. The moment he saw the black hole, he was stunned. Whether it was Luo Fan, Empty Maiden in a different timeline, or Hun Ku, the same thought flashed through their minds. At the same time, the three of them had different feelings. They were all so complicated that they could not be described with words. After the black hole appeared, it faintly emitted an indescribable aura. It seemed to belong to this universe on Earth, but also seemed to belong to another perfect world. At this moment, the shadow of a vortex gradually condensed in the void. This time, the phantom didn't feel like it was going to dissipate. From the beginning, it was rushing in the direction of completely condensing. In a short while, it was already halfway condensed. It faintly exuded an incomparably majestic and supreme aura. That was the will of heaven and earth. Obviously, such an intense change had finally awakened the will of heaven and earth from its deep slumber. At this moment, for Empty Maiden in a different timeline, it was the most dangerous moment. Hurry up. We can't wait for the will of heaven and earth to completely materialize. Upon seeing this scene, Luo Fan hurriedly shouted, "Hurry up! We can't wait for the will of heaven and earth to completely materialize." The more he understood the will of heaven and earth, the more he knew how powerful it was. In the third disaster, the will of the world that he encountered was not a complete will of the world. It was only an incomplete will of the world, but it was enough to make him run for his life. In the end, if he did not make a breakthrough at the last moment and obtain the ability to attack his opponent on a conceptual level, he might have died in the third disaster. Because of this experience, he had a better understanding of the power of the will of heaven and earth than anyone else. He knew that if he really went against the will of heaven and earth, what awaited him would be a tragic death. After understanding this, it was reasonable for him to be anxious. Hearing this, Empty Maiden in a different timeline also had a solemn expression. Her body instantly disintegrated and turned into a cloud of smoke. She began to wrap around the stone in her hand and slowly injected it into the black hole. As the smoke that was her body was injected into it, the black hole gradually expanded from the size of a fist to the size of a volleyball, then the size of a basketball, then the size of a wash basin. In the end, when Empty Maiden in a different timeline had injected almost all of her smoke into it, the black hole finally stabilized at a diameter of 30 feet. At this moment, the black hole began to tremble slightly, and an indescribable strange sound faintly came from it. The sound was mysterious and wonderful. Hearing this sound, even Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. As for the vortex that was formed by the will of heaven and earth in the void, it began to gradually collapse and gradually disappear. Not long after, it completely disappeared as if it had never appeared. At this moment, the hearts of all living beings in the entire earth surged with an indescribable joy. Amidst this joy, they also felt that somewhere in the earth's universe, there was an indescribable calling for them. It was unknown how many cultivators were rushing towards Earth from all directions at this moment. A faint, mysterious light began to emit from the black hole at this moment. This mysterious light gradually changed the appearance of the black hole, causing it to wriggle and gradually turn into a stone door. This stone door looked like a rather peculiar rune that emitted all sorts of indescribable information in the void of the universe. This information told all living beings what kind of channel this was, what kind of world they could reach through this channel, and so on and so forth. There was almost no end to the content. At this moment, the mist in front of the stone door began to condense, and after a short while, the Void Lady from a different timeline appeared. However, she seemed extremely illusory at this moment. She simply looked like a shadow. After appearing, she was a little lost at first, but she gradually came back to her senses. A strange smile appeared on her face as she murmured, "Seems like I've succeeded." At this moment, she was already extremely weak. She could only barely maintain herself in the void of the universe. She did not even have the ability to move. If one were to look at her realm, she was currently more resilient and adaptable compared to mortals. The terrifying might that surpassed the Supreme Emperor and the supreme means that could even destroy the entire world could no longer be found at this moment. At this moment, Hunku's eyes were filled with joy and heartache. She hurriedly released a wave of power that completely enveloped Empty Maiden in a different timeline, forming an extremely natural domain around her. This allowed Empty Maiden in a different timeline to have the best living environment at this moment. She did not need to rely on her much stronger adaptability than ordinary people to resist the invasion of the void of the universe. Chapter 1971. When Hanko heard the words of the Empty Maiden from a different timeline, her expression became even more pained. She had turned from a supreme powerhouse to an ordinary creature that did not even have the ability to survive in the void of the universe. The degree of degeneration was so great that it was beyond the imagination of living beings. Her mother, who had suffered such a blow, still had to comfort her. How sad was this situation? When the Empty Maiden from a different timeline saw this, she could not help but feel helpless. What she said wasn't just to comfort Hanku, but because she truly felt that she had obtained a huge opportunity. When the portal stabilized, the will of heaven and earth had disappeared again. At this moment, the center of the Earth's universe had returned to its peaceful state. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the portal had completely stabilized. Its influence and changes on the Earth's universe had been completely stabilized. Although it still had some influence on the Earth's universe, it would no longer stimulate the will of heaven and earth that was in a deep sleep. Because of this, the will of heaven and earth had fallen into a deep sleep again. Of course, this situation could only happen in the Earth's universe. If it was in other worlds, the will of heaven and earth would be completely awake. Any slight damage to the world would instantly awaken the will of heaven and earth, causing it to send all kinds of punishments. It was only in the Earth's universe. The will of heaven and earth had fallen into a deep sleep. That was why it did not react to such a change. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He said, "Let's leave. This place will become lively soon." Hearing this, the Empty Maiden from a different timeline did not say anything. Instead, Hanku spoke up. She immediately nodded and said, "That's right. Mother is going to recultivate now. I don't have time to waste on them." The Empty Maiden from a different timeline wanted to explain things to the other cultivators. However, after hearing Hanku's words, she sighed and nodded. He sighed, nodded and said, "Then let's go." She had already thought it through. She had done everything she could for the Earth's universe in this timeline. No matter what the Earth's universe would become in the future, it would not make much difference whether she was there or not. Under such circumstances, what was the point of staying here and explaining anything to the other cultivators? Could it be that he wanted to show the other cultivators that he was the one who set up this passage? Should I make them feel grateful to me? Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, a wave of law energy enveloped the two of them. With a light step forward, his figure flashed, and he had already stepped into the stone rune door. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable ripple spread out from the stone door. It swept across the entire earth, causing all living beings in the earth to feel an indescribable sense of sadness and reluctance. It was as if they instinctively knew that there was an existence who had done them a great favor. It was as if he had completely left them. With this feeling, the cultivators who were rushing over from all directions began to speed up. Their figures began to move towards the Earth's universe from all directions. Not long after, they quickly gathered in one place and began to appear in front of the stone rune door. Most of these living beings were the ones who had appeared in the center of the Earth's universe and stood with the Empty Maiden from a different timeline. Since they were able to stand with the Empty Maiden from a different timeline, it was clear that they had a close connection with her. It could even be said that they were cultivators like the Empty Maiden's disciples. Because of this, their feelings for the Empty Maiden from a different timeline were naturally deeper than the other cultivators. They naturally felt more strongly about the Empty Maiden's departure than the other cultivators. "There's teacher's aura on it," one of the cultivators said. Hearing this, the expressions of the other cultivators who were originally sad and felt that they had been abandoned by the Empty Maiden from a different timeline suddenly changed. An impulsive cultivator appeared next to the cultivator, grabbed the cultivator's clothes, and yanked them over, shouting, "Is what you said true? There really is teacher's aura on it." Although the cultivator who was grabbed was extremely dissatisfied with being treated so rudely, In the end, his feelings for his teacher prevailed. He suppressed his dissatisfaction and said, "That's right. I will take responsibility for what I said." Hearing this, the cultivator's expression changed drastically. Impossible, impossible. How could teacher's aura be on this passageway? Originally, it was very normal for a certain creation to be contaminated with the aura of a certain living being or a certain powerhouse. After all, if it was created by a certain living being or a powerhouse, it was naturally very normal for it to be contaminated with that person's aura. However, at this moment, all of the cultivators here understood that this situation was completely different from other normal situations. This was because an indescribable passageway had appeared in front of them. No matter how much confidence they had in their teacher and how powerful she was, they did not think that she could easily open up this passageway. Given this background, there was only one possibility for the presence of such an aura in the passageway. That was, their teacher had sacrificed herself and used an ability that she could not bear to construct this passageway. This kind of understanding was something that a truly rational cultivator could think of. Because of this, after confirming that there was the aura of the empty maiden from a different timeline, they felt as if their parents had passed away. "I plan to directly enter the passageway to take a look," one of the cultivators said. As he spoke, he did not even wait for the other cultivators to reply, and directly rushed into the rune gate. He rushed straight toward the other side of the passageway. Although they had already learned about the function and characteristics of the passageway from the information contained on the runestone door, they were still unable to understand it. However, that was merely what the stone rune door had described to him. As for the specific use of this passageway and what kind of side effects it had, they still could not be sure. Therefore, the cultivator in front of them charged through just like that. Obviously, he was not trying to transcend this Earth universe as quickly as possible and leave this place that might be extremely dangerous. There could only be one intention, and that was to search for the traces of the empty maiden from a different timeline and to find out where she had gone. As a cultivator rushed into the passageway, the other cultivators took action one after another. They either started to test the passageway and started to sense the mysterious structure of the stone gate, or they directly did what the cultivator did. They directly rushed into the passageway and headed towards the other end of the passageway. Those who rushed into the passageway had naturally disappeared from this Earth universe and could no longer be found. On the other hand, those cultivators who were carefully searching the Earth's universe and preparing to thoroughly investigate the truth of the Earth's universe didn't find anything at all. They couldn't find out how the stone door was formed, and they couldn't imagine what kind of mysteries it contained. For them, the biggest gain from thoroughly investigating the stone gate was that they knew that the stone gate was not something that they could understand at the moment. It was not something that they could study. Time passed slowly, and before they knew it, 100 years had passed. During these 100 years, an additional continent appeared in the center of this Earth universe. It was an extremely vast continent that seemed to have a radius of several light years. The continent was now densely packed with countless cultivators. These cultivators gathered on this continent and gradually gave birth to cities. In the end, they even formed countries, causing the entire continent to become extremely prosperous. These cultivators were none other than the cultivators from various places in this Earth universe who had rushed over after sensing the changes here. They were also extremely cautious. Since they did not know what the stone gate represented, they did not dare to rush into the passageway and head towards the unknown world. Of course, such a situation would only occur if they had not sensed any danger in the Earth's universe. After all, if this Earth universe had really reached its most dangerous moment, such as being on the verge of collapse or destruction, they would definitely rush in regardless of how dangerous the passageway was and how they did not understand what was going on. Why would they even open up a continent, establish a sect, and form a country here because of hesitation? Of course, this was not all. There were countless living beings who were desperate, adventurous, or even wanted to search for traces of the Sky Lady from an alternate timeline. They streaked across the sky and charged into the stone gate in the sky. They began to pass through the stone gate and rushed into the passageway that connected the Earth universe and a fragment of the world, heading towards the depths of the passageway. As a result, both the continent and the surroundings of the passageway became extremely lively. If this trend continued, it could be predicted that this place would become the center of the cultivation world in this Earth universe. It would become the cultivation holy land in the hearts of many cultivators. After countless years, this place might even be sealed due to various changes, becoming a passageway for exiles or a passageway for rewards. This was the case when the situation had not changed. However, it was clear that, back then, the Sky Lady from an alternate timeline had decided to sacrifice everything to leave a hope for the living beings in this Earth universe, so that they could escape the fate of being destroyed in this timeline. It was obvious that she did not do this for the sake of this outcome. Therefore, changes soon appeared. This change was actually very simple. It was the first cultivator who had rushed through the passageway. Finally, after more than 100 years, when all living beings had almost forgotten about him, he rushed out of the passageway and shouted, "This passageway was indeed created by Teacher. It leads to a whole new world. The cultivation environment there is countless times better than that of our Earth universe." Because the Sky Lady from an alternate timeline had almost become the ruler of this Earth universe at that time. Therefore, the other cultivators in this Earth universe naturally agreed with the way she addressed this Earth universe. Therefore, even though many cultivators here did not know where the Earth universe was, they also knew why this place was called the Earth universe. Why is this place called the Earth universe? It will also be in this universe. This person's words. In an instant, countless cultivators on this continent were stunned. Then, all kinds of incredible calls came from all over the continent. Some cultivators who knew this cultivator began to soar into the sky from all over the continent and began to quickly approach this cultivator. They wanted to investigate whether this cultivator was the original cultivator or was something else in disguise. The cultivator also knew their intentions. At this time, he just smiled and let the other cultivators do whatever they wanted. Very soon, all the cultivators who had thoroughly investigated were certain. This cultivator in front of them was indeed the first cultivator who had rushed into the passageway. For a moment, the crowd was surging with emotions and began to become excited. Seeing this, the cultivator said with a serious expression. Then, with a heavy expression, he said, "However, I also discovered a fact over the years." What fact? The other cultivators' hearts skipped a beat. It must be said that at this time, they were very concerned about this passageway. In fact, they were already paying attention to this passageway. If there were any abnormalities or side effects, it would be a huge blow to them. The cultivator said, "In this passageway, the aura that belongs to Teacher is simply too dense. According to my calculations, only when Teacher completely entrusted his everything to this passageway could there be such a dense aura." This caused the surrounding cultivators to suddenly fall silent. At that moment, all sorts of indescribable emotions surfaced in their hearts. "You're saying that Teacher sacrificed himself to create this passageway so that we could have a way out when the universe was destroyed?" One of the cultivators said with an extremely shocked expression. "That's right, that's what I mean." The cultivator who came out was touched, pained, and indescribably depressed. To cultivators, their lives were the most precious existence. Even if they had to give up everything, they would not be willing to give up their lives. Under such circumstances, to suddenly hear that someone had given up their own life to leave a chance for others to survive, the shock was self-evident. At this moment, more and more cultivators began to kneel toward the passageway. Every region within countless light years of the continent fell silent. A solemn aura spread out, turning the originally bustling continent that seemed like an ordinary world into the scene of a memorial service. An indescribably powerful intent gradually surged into the passageway. It was transmitted to an unknown place through the passageway and was absorbed by an unknown existence. It should be noted that the living beings who were kneeling and kowtowing were not ordinary living beings. They were powerful cultivators who could gather at the center of the universe from every corner of Earth's universe, from places that were billions of light years apart. Any one of these cultivators could destroy billions of ordinary living beings with a single breath. If such existences had countless beings kowtowing toward a certain individual, it was naturally impossible for the kowtowing of ordinary living beings to not cause any changes. Their beliefs, their willpower, also contained endless power. At this moment, this power was transmitted into the passageway through some mysterious connection toward the individual they were kowtowing toward. All the cultivators sensed this change. However, they were even more certain that this passageway had been created by Space Lady from an alternate timeline, sacrificing herself. At that moment, they became even more sincere as they kowtowed, and the intent they displayed became more and more clear. This also caused the faith and intent to become more and more vast. It vaguely changed the space-time around the passageway, causing the passageway to emit a white light. It looked like it had turned into a vast heaven. The kowtowing lasted for a few days before all the cultivators gradually returned to their senses. After confirming the truth of the passageway, the situation in the entire continent would naturally undergo a huge change. At this moment, more and more cultivators stepped into the passageway and headed toward the cultivation environment that was said to be countless times more wonderful than Earth's. In the passageway, they truly sensed the aura of Space Lady from an alternate timeline, and all of them became even more touched. Of course, although many cultivators had already stepped in the passageway, it was clear that not all cultivators had stepped into it. After all, everyone's heart was different. There were also many cultivators who were reluctant to leave Earth's universe or had doubts in their hearts. However, they still stayed on the continent in front of the passageway and continued their original lives. Moreover, because other cultivators had abandoned the continent and left, they obtained more space and could obtain more benefits more easily. As a result, they reaped great benefits. Chapter 1973. As the liquid transformed the cultivator's body, his power, and the laws of his body began to change in an indescribable way. Amidst these changes, the essence of his body began to gradually change to a state that adapted to this world. All sorts of indescribable ripples continuously radiated from his body, and a tribulation cloud gradually appeared above his head. Immediately after, countless bolts of lightning bolted down from the tribulation clouds, heading straight for the cultivator. Each of these lightning bolts was extremely ordinary and simple, as if they were just ordinary lightning bolts. However, the moment the cultivator felt the lightning, he felt as if his body, his power, and his essence were about to be completely destroyed in the next instant. He felt as if he would be completely erased from the world. Along with this feeling, the cultivator understood that this lightning wasn't something he could defend against. For a moment, all sorts of indescribable emotions welled up from the depths of his heart. In the end, all these emotions turned into one sentence. It's a pity that I didn't find teacher. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was far away, had already made his move. With a thought, he waved his hand, and an indescribable energy stirred. In an instant, it completely changed the world. Endless energy gathered on the tribulation cloud, and with a slight twist, the tribulation cloud had already collapsed. All the energy within the tribulation cloud had completely dissipated, and instead it was directed downwards, directly into the boundless liquid below. Although the tribulation cloud was boundlessly frightening to that cultivator, it was still a tribulation cloud. Just the aura alone was enough to intimidate the cultivator to the point where he couldn't resist at all. However, for Luo Fan, it was a different story. This was only the power of an ant. If he wanted to deal with it, it was really as simple as using his mind. In fact, all sorts of indescribable changes were happening to the laws of heaven and earth at this moment. This was the annihilation of the tribulations. Eliminate. From then on, it became the fundamental law of this world. From now on, Any tribulations encountered by any cultivator who stepped into this place would be destroyed and converted into energy that would be used to transform the cultivator below, making the transformation process even smoother. At this moment, Hun-Kuh finally returned to her senses with a face full of shame. If it wasn't for Father, I'm afraid I would have missed something big this time. Luo Fan just smiled. You just lack experience, that's all. If you have more experience, this kind of thing will be child's play. Hearing this, Hun-Kuh looked even more ashamed. However, she knew that Luo Fan was just comforting her. In fact, this was not experience at all. After all, even though she was inexperienced, she had been the Celestial Empress for millions of years. His control over the world and his ability to adapt to various situations should have long reached the point of perfection and reached the acme of perfection. But now, he was actually stunned by the abnormal changes. He didn't know how to deal with it, how to react. How could this kind of clumsiness happen to a Sky Emperor? At this moment, she made up her mind that she would work hard to make up for this weakness. Luo Fan didn't pay much attention to Hun-Kuh's resentment. At this moment, he was only paying attention to the changes that were happening to the cultivator in the world in front of him. Under the cleansing of the liquid, the cultivator's essence gradually turned into a constitution that was a mixture of the Earth's universe and this world. This constitution allowed him to adapt to the laws of this world and the great Tao of this world. At the same time, he didn't lose the essence of the Earth's universe, nor did he lose the ability to adapt to the laws of the Earth's universe. This change was naturally formed under his control. The reason for this was because Luo Fan himself also came from the Earth's universe, but he didn't want to see the cultivator in front of him completely abandon the essence of the Earth's universe. This could be said to be the last remaining thought he had about the Earth's universe. In fact, it was precisely because he still retained the cultivator's essence as a creature from the Earth's universe that the transformation process of the cultivator would cause a heavenly tribulation. After all, if the cultivator was completely transformed into the essence of the world, it would be equivalent to directly changing the foundation of the creature, making it completely cater to the world and wholeheartedly assimilate into the world. Under such circumstances, the world would be more than happy to welcome the cultivator. So how could a heavenly tribulation appear? On the other hand, if it was like what Luo Fan was doing now, he would retain the original essence. Yet he wanted to bestow the essence of this world to that cultivator. That was simply equivalent to completely mixing oil and water, and it was equivalent to using an external pollution to contaminate this world. It would be strange if it didn't cause a heavenly tribulation. After the heavenly tribulation disappeared, the cultivator felt an indescribable sense of comfort from the bottom of his heart. His connection with the world instantly strengthened by several times, and he even vaguely felt like he had returned to the Earth's universe. The feeling of being able to do as he pleased and unleashing great power really made him feel a little intoxicated. This went on for an unknown period of time before the cultivator returned to his senses. At this moment, he had already left the world that was transforming his body through some unknown method and appeared in a palace. This palace was none other than the guiding immortal palace. It's up to you now. Luo Fan turned to look at Hun-Kuh and said with a smile. Hun-Kuh was the celestial emperor of this world. After all, it was naturally more convenient for him to accept other cultivators into this world, arrange their lives, and arrange their duties. Hun-Kuh had already mentally prepared herself, so there was naturally nothing much to say at a time like this. She simply nodded and agreed to it, issuing orders one after another. She directly ordered the officials under her to set up an organization here, preparing to make arrangements for the cultivators who came from the Earth's universe. As for the specifics of the arrangements, she no longer cared. After all, the Heaven Court was now a complete organization. How should the newcomers be handled? There was already a complete set of rules and regulations, and even Hun-Kuh could not break it at will. Soon, an official came and appeared before the powerful cultivator. The official's strength was only that of an innate Grand Luo. Even before the cultivator, he appeared rather weak. However, he was an official of the Heaven Court after all, and in this world, he was blessed by the Heaven Court. In fact, just as words alone were enough to suppress the cultivator. This was confirmed after the cultivator probed him once. In the end, the cultivator was assigned to the guiding fairy palace to be on duty. After all, the guiding fairy palace was only an empty shell at the moment, and if they wanted it to function properly, naturally, there was a need to fill it up so that all the positions in the admitting immortal palace were occupied. Clearly, cultivators who ascended from the Earth's universe were the best choice to fill up those positions. First of all, as a senior, his existence could give the cultivators who came later confidence, making them believe that this place was not a bad place. Secondly, as a senior, he could communicate better with other cultivators. The cultivator was naturally overjoyed by this arrangement. The doubts in his heart about this world also began to gradually decrease. Just as the cultivator was deep in thought, multicolored light surged in the passageway. Another existence was entering this world through the passageway. Seeing this, the official frowned and said, "Get to work. I have specific arrangements here. Make arrangements for the latecomers according to the rules." With that, the official tossed a stone slab to the cultivator. The cultivator caught the stone slab and looked at it. Endless information poured into his mind, allowing him to instantly understand the rules. The doubts that had almost disappeared in his heart finally disappeared completely. Only the last bit of them did not disappear completely before he saw this world with his own eyes. At this moment, a figure that the cultivator was extremely familiar with rushed out of the passageway and stood at the exit with a somewhat confused look. At the same time, a strange pressure acted on the cultivator's body, causing the inside of the cultivator's body to crackle like countless bombs had been set off. As the sound echoed, the cultivator's dazed expression quickly turned into one of pain. It was as if he was experiencing endless and horrifying pain. Just at this moment, a ray of light descended from the sky and enveloped the cultivator's body. As the light enveloped him, the crackling sounds on the cultivator's body disappeared. Seeing this, the cultivator who had entered this world before revealed a look of understanding. It was clear that he had thought of what he had encountered before, and the worry in his heart disappeared. At this moment, the shadow of a world appeared above the cultivator's head. Within it, there was a boundless amount of liquid that was surging and rippling. The light that enveloped the cultivator seemed to be the shadow of that world. As the light wrapped around the cultivator, he gradually floated up. In the end, he broke through the boundary and entered that world, fusing with the liquid. What happened next was the same as the cultivator who had entered first, but there was no need to elaborate. In just a few hours, the cultivator had been transferred to the celestial palace and appeared before the cultivator who had entered first. "Welcome to the heavenly realm," the cultivator who had entered first said with a smile. The cultivator who had come later was stunned and did not know how to react to this sudden change. Didn't the person in front of him pass through the tunnel before him? How did he suddenly become a ninja of this heavenly realm? The cultivator did not make much of a fuss and allowed the cultivator to become a member of the celestial palace according to the rules. With a thought, he passed on the information that the cultivator needed to know, causing the cultivator to understand what was going on in the blink of an eye. At this moment, his expression was one of sorrow and joy, and it was extremely complicated. What happened next did not need to be said. More and more cultivators came out of the tunnel and adapted to this world through modification. Then they were all given responsibilities. They either stayed here or left the celestial palace. At this moment, everything seemed to be going extremely smoothly. Those cultivators thought that there would be a steady stream of cultivators coming in, but the development of the situation gave them a head-on blow. In just a few short years, after thousands of cultivators came through the tunnel, they kept waiting, but not many cultivators came in. Even if there were cultivators who occasionally came in, they seemed to have thrown all caution to the wind. They treated themselves as if they had no other choice. It was as if this was a dragon's pool and tiger's den. This situation, the first cultivator who had entered the tunnel could not understand at all. What's going on? Why is it like this? He grabbed the other cultivators and asked. One of the cultivators who came later sighed and explained the situation, causing the other cultivator to be stunned. So it's like this. Their suspicions of teacher are actually so deep. They're simply ungrateful. After hearing all the reasons, the cultivator roared. His voice was like a thunderclap that spread far and wide, causing the entire celestial palace to tremble violently. It was as if a strong earthquake had struck the celestial palace. Hearing this roar, the cultivators who came later all looked ashamed. After all, according to the cultivator, they were also one of the ungrateful creatures. If it weren't for all sorts of accidents, they probably still wouldn't have dared to step into that passage and enter this world. I want to go back. After the roar, the cultivator said. In his heart, he had already made up his mind. He must wake up those cultivators who doubted the existence of the space woman in the alternate timeline. He must let them know how great of a favor their teacher had given them, and how great of a price he had paid for it. However, although this tunnel was not one way, it was not the kind that could be used to travel between two sides. It was easy to travel from that side. However, if one wanted to go back from this side, it would be many times more difficult. Although the cultivator had already made up his mind, it was not that easy for him to take action. At the very least, he needed to apply and obtain approval from his superiors. This application process took several years and even exhausted all of the contributions he had made over the years. He had almost lost his position before he was barely able to obtain approval. However, after that, he would have to work for nothing for tens of thousands of years to make up for the price he had paid. It could be said that the magnitude of the sacrifice was self-evident. When the other cultivators found out about this, they felt both admiration and shame. What he admired was that cultivator's courage, but what he was ashamed of was that he couldn't do the same thing. After that, the cultivator spent a great deal of effort to pass through the tunnel and return to Earth's universe. Not long after the cultivator stepped into the tunnel, an indescribably mysterious power passed through the tunnel and into this world. It caused the light and shadows in the surroundings to change endlessly, and it even caused colorful clouds to appear in the void before it flowed into a certain place in the void. That place was none other than the world that Luo Fan had opened up for the space woman in the alternate timeline. The power seemed to be guided by a fixed path and charged into the body of the space woman in the alternate timeline. In an instant, an extremely sacred and dazzling halo appeared behind the space woman's head. Under the halo, the entire world began to surge violently. Endless laws and laws began to produce all sorts of mysterious changes that could not be described with words. The mysteries that the space woman in the alternate timeline had pursued over the years, but could not clearly comprehend, were revealed before her without reservation. This is will faith. In a trance, the space woman in the alternate timeline who was cultivating in the alternate timeline already knew what the power that had traveled through space and entered her body was. It had even changed the laws and laws of the entire world. The will and faith seemed to be similar to the faith in the godly path, but in reality, they were fundamentally different from that kind of faith. That kind of faith was a devout thought that was produced when a living being worshipped a certain existence. Fundamentally speaking, it was a kind of mysterious power that was produced when a living being entrusted its spirit to another being. However, the will and faith were completely different now. The will and faith were formed from a living being's intense gratitude towards a certain existence. What was contained in this kind of will and faith was not at all entrusted, but a complete dedication. The dedication allowed the will and faith to possess the various magical effects of faith, but it did not have the hidden dangers of faith. It could be said that it was a supreme power that only had benefits and no drawbacks. It was precisely because of this that such power could directly fuse with Empty Lady's body in an alternate timeline. It was also the reason why she could truly feel that she had obtained unimaginable benefits from it. After so many years of training, the Empty Maiden, who was in an alternate timeline, had reforged the foundation of her training. Although her foundation was several times more stable than before, it was still just a foundation. She had not recovered much of her fundamental power. However, as the power poured into her, her power began to expand like a balloon. In just a short period of time, She had already begun to charge towards the itinerant immortal realm and was about to cross the boundary. She had reached the immortal realm again.